conversations about it. So I'm gonna call him back and we'll chat about it some more. He was intrigued to hear that Cornford and Gilbert Murray and Jane Harrison had been three people all working together on the same project, effectively, to de well, I guess I'm using the wrong word, to remystify the Greeks who had previously been treated as these absolute intellects, who were anomalous and came from nowhere and, questioned all of the religious traditional things and thereby invented science and philosophy. And these three were saying that couldn't be further from the truth. It might be convenient for salving our own egos in imagining that they're our ancestors and they're the forebears intellectually of us. But these guys argue it's impossible to understand Greek philosophy or science without understanding their religion and mythology. And because the reason certain answers were appealing to Greek philosophers was because they were religious people. And frequently they tell us directly that that's happening, but modern readers just skip that part because they're like, I don't know what that is. That's some sort of noise in the line. And then they skip down to the part where it sounds like Empedocles is inventing atoms. And they're like, see, he's a scientist. He's talking about atoms. And they skip the part where he invented atoms in order to justify his Orphic Pythagorean view of the cosmos and reincarnation. He needed atoms in order to fill in a gap in his logic. And that's what they're doing there, says Cornford, and he proves it very nicely. And not only does he prove it, he basically quotes Empedocles saying, yes, I have this problem. I think I'll invent atoms to solve it. So we just skip that part and say, no, he was a scientist. He saw deeply, rationally into the cosmos and he detected atoms there. It's like, no, he did not. That's
Hey, hey,
Oh,
Rick,
okay. This is
hey,
interesting.
hey, Rick, that's blasphemy. You're killing the prime mover. You're
yeah,
killing all prime mover. Come on
I,
now.
I'm
God,
messing with
God.
sacred things. I really am. I suck.
Okay.
Well,
In less than 5 paragraphs, tell us how the insertion of atoms figured in this from that perspective.
So his atoms represent the four elements, right? He's saying tiny particles of the four elements are mixed in us to create us. Well, that all sounds very scientific and rational. We can imagine maybe he was wrong about four, and maybe it's 117 or whatever, but we feel like we're dealing with a kindred spirit. Except Empedocles didn't say there were four elements; he said there were six elements, and the other two elements were love and strife. And love and strife, were what brought things together, love, eros, or caused things to separate apart, eris. And he saw the dome of the heavens as a giant hollow sphere in which, it was alternately through different periods of the equivalent of moral day and moral night, dominated by either eros or eris. And that this explained why sometimes things come together and they form people, and then sometimes they come apart. And of course, we assume that the coming apart must be a bad thing. But we've actually got it backwards because he saw Eris, strife, as creating the situation in which they start to mingle together. This is
Rick,
the crazy part. This is what we don't
Rick,
read very well. He sees,
Rick, you're describing gravity and dark energy.
well, I
Come
know
on.
you can read all kinds of modern physics directly into it, but for him, it's his way of refuting Parmenides
Oh,
and basically updating Anaximander's model of the cosmos with the bare minimum number of changes required in order to make it satisfy his Orphic religion and Pythagorean religion. He's trying to merge together these theologies to create a cosmos of alternating cycles of.
This is Empedocles. It's been primarily referred to.
Yes,
The
yes.
one that threw himself in the volcano.
Well, I mean, if you can believe anything Diogenes Laertius says about how these people die, they always die in some conveniently, ironic form that illustrates the fallacy of their philosophy. So Kenneth Smith says the thing about Diogenes Laertius is he's a gossip on the one hand, so you get some good stuff, but you get some bad stuff. But he's also a peasant-oriented ironist whose goal is to show that those smarty pants they weren't so smart because after all, look what stupid things they died from, and it was
oh,
always something that proved that refuted their own philosophy.
well, but that sounds a lot like Russians falling out of windows. It really does. Come on now.
He
It's all
said
coming true.
he said Heraclitus died of dropsy, and the Greeks believe that dropsy is when is when the vital things in your body cease to flow. Oh, what a coincidence! It's like so. No, probably not.
If,
Um,
if only these Greek scientists had had differential equations, we'd have been in a shitload of trouble right now.
Imagine what they could have made of that. Yeah, Cornford's got a great section on Heraclitus that I read, I think Friday, in which he really challenged my understanding of Heraclitus, and I'm going to have to spend some more time with it. But and then he goes on from there through all the pre-Socratics, through Socrates, through Plato, and ultimately through Aristotle, and he ties all of these philosophies back to kind of an anthropological review of pre-Olympian Greek religion. When back when they believed in daemons, back when they had a tribal structure with clans, phratries, and how they organized the cosmos according to their, the tribal organization. It's really interesting stuff.
I've always believed in that revisionism was the basis of history. That's
Yes.
describing the whole thing as revisionism, right?
That's what
Let's
Cornford
just
is
put
saying,
another
right?
equation in here and all that.
People just keep sort of patching their original beliefs, and next thing you know, they've accidentally invented atoms. It's like, I just looking at 40 years of work in medical informatics, that's sort of how it goes. It's a lot closer to the truth. But 40 years ago, the people who were doing medical informatics had no idea where it was going to end up. I mean, I was there. We didn't know. It's like
You
we
put
did sort
another
of
light,
hack our way
put
into
another
history.
light on Hegel. Hegel is the prime revisionist. That's
Yeah. I think about that saying that, every war is fought using strategies that might have worked in the previous war but aren't going to work in this war. And we like the invention of the machine gun, was people were totally unprepared for the Gatling gun. And they just marched their little lines of people into the machine guns of World War I over and over and over and
Yeah,
kept being
I
surprised.
might have a correction there for you, Rick.
Please, please.
Yeah, I don't know if it was actually the machine gun itself, which was a big problem. I think nobody else has said this, that the problem was the invention of smokeless powder,
Oh yeah.
because previous weapons had the great advantage of laying down a huge smoke screen for everybody.
Right.
I remember the Zulus saying that there was so much smoke generated by those Henry Martini rifles that they crawled along the ground and the bullets were whizzing overhead.
Yeah.
They said the thing that worried them were the bayonets that were waiting for them when they finally got to the line. But
Right. Right.
yeah, smokeless powder came in the 1890s. And of course, we start having weapons which would still be regarded as okay today. You had the Mausers showing up and stuff like that. Now, with the smokeless powder, everyone's shooting their machine guns and the battlefield remains relatively visible, which is what happened in World War One. Nobody else has said this, but
It's an excellent
keep
point.
it in mind. Keep it
Yes.
in mind that when you can actually see things to shoot
It's a
at
little
them,
scarier.
it's very
The gun becomes a lot
advantageous.
scarier. That's a
You
great
know,
point, Stephen.
Stephen, I saw a picture published somewhere recently of a Maxim machine gun that was in use in Ukraine.
The Russians used the old style machine guns in World War II.
I mean,
So
I don't know I don't remember which side was using it, but it was clearly the old Maxim with all the fins and the water jacket and all that stuff. But that was a very reliable gun. It's been
yeah, well, it's
through
only 100 years old. What's wrong with that?
nothing.
Exactly.
You
You've got
the
a
Browning.
prejudicial view of things which are 100 years old. See?
Yeah.
Like
So
Cornford's book, which is more than 100 years old. Yes.
here, Rick, I have here. I'll show you some pictures so you can see this. This is the
Oh,
prolegomena. to the
Oh,
Study of Greek Religion by
it
Jane
certainly
Harris.
is. My goodness.
And here is Themis and the Epilegomena. I don't know her subsequent. That's
Yeah.
stuff. These I got. Here's an old. All of these things date to the 60s. They're
You
not
found
really.
them.
They're not really that old.
You
But
found
that's,
them.
I think, the last time they were really printed. Was
Oh, I'm so excited.
yeah. Well, you've got hope. I don't know. Yeah, one of these is really good. The list price on this is $2.45. So
Those were the days.
yeah, it was pre Jimmy Carter, I think.
A buck could buy something back then.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
These are all like I think from the 60s.
Those are on my list to read next. I mean, I have one more book I have to read before them, and that's the sequel to From Religion to Philosophy, which was the book that Cornford was working on when he died, and that W.K.C. Guthrie brought out. That is Principium Sapientiae. That's also on the Internet Archive, although you can't download it for free. It was published just a little too late. But I bet in about 3 years you'll be able to. But you can read it online. You can borrow it for an hour at a time and read it online, and then re-borrow it again and keep until you're done. That's what I'm going to do, and I'll
Yeah.
be doing that starting today.
So Jane Harrison was
She's
born in 1850. She's 100 years older than me,
Yes.
and no telling how much smarter.
These guys are smart. I mean, Cornford's command of Greek and Latin and a very large number of different classical works is far in excess of mine. I mean, he's highly educated, and I know he felt indebted to Harrison and thought she was more highly educated than he was.
Well, yeah, she had a master's degree or something. Who knows? But
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's Gilbert or something. I think it was that like said he tried to read through everything, all the stuff in Greek about every 2 or 3 years. He just kept
To refresh it.
refresh it, keep his Greek up.
Yeah.
We're
It's necessary. I mean, how else are you going to keep track of all this stuff? And what's really clear from Cornford's argument is how often the brightest insights are found in the weirdest places. Aristotle will just make an aside on the middle of some other argument, and that aside captures a critical stage in the development of Greek religion. And if you look around, you'll find a couple other. Plato might refer to it here, and Xenophanes might refer to it there, but they never write an essay on it because they all know it. Why would they spend any time on it? But for us who don't know it, it's like that's our evidence. It's like these people from these widely disparate areas are all referring back to this same thing that we didn't even know happened.
I have a warning about the moderns. And I've noticed this with a lot of moderns, that they believe that they can know everything purely through ideas.
Right.
And I think I've occasionally discovered, and I've mentioned this to other people, that if you actually go and practice something, your experience and awareness and consciousness of everything is so different from what you expected it to be.
Yes.
From simply thinking about it.
Yes.
But we live in a culture which is obsessed with the ability that this thing that if you idealize something, that's it.
Right.
I was trying to tell this young guy about going out with girls. I said, you can think about it and dream about it.
The reality is going to be
and
really
then you can actually try it. And
good luck.
And unfortunately, reality doesn't tend to be as great as the dreams. Unfortunately, it's
I'm with you 100%. I mean, I think that my long career as a programmer who has to support his own software, and therefore all of my bugs come home to roost, I think that really prepared me to be an existentialist philosopher. Because, like you say, I say, well, this program does X, Y, and Z, and then someone will report the behavior at a site and it doesn't match X, Y, or Z. And I'm like, well, that's weird. look, I can prove that they shouldn't be doing that. And I'll open up the code and go, see, it does this, and then it does this, and Donald will know this experience. And then you read the next line and go, oh, no. Who wrote that? Oh, it was me. This isn't right at all. Suddenly the reality of the software knocks the nonsense of the ideas out of your head when you're confronted with the fact that this software doesn't do what you knew it did.
It does focus your mind. You know, a hard failure.
Yes.
You know, but yes. I do remember some years, like 40-something years ago, when at one point I could actually remember all the code I'd ever written.
Yep.
And I was incredibly productive because I just anything happened, I knew right where it happened. And now it's sort of like, yeah, I'll have to look that up. I know I wrote it, but I don't.
Yes. But I think that programmers who work in shops where they don't have to support their own code, where somebody else is the support staff and has to debug it, I think those people might be more likely to become escapist philosophers because there's nothing challenging their ideas about somebody else's problem.
I think, you know, that I've seen it by design too often. There are sort of architects and designers and implementers and testers, and the idea is nobody is responsible.
Right.
Where, you know, where I like doing the upfront stuff. It's sort of where a lot of the creativity occurs.
Mm-hmm.
But honestly, I made my living being the last debugger on a project. Everybody else has moved on.
Yes.
And now it's all mine, and I can finally fix it. You know?
Without somebody else's fingers in there.
You know, and it's you know, my employers have always liked that. I'm willing to stay with a project, whereas a lot of people have 18 to 24 months. It's time to move on.
Yes.
So that you don't leave enduring fingerprints on work products.
Yeah.
Enough of that. We can.
Well, this goes nicely into the line that Sharon was admiring a couple of weeks ago about the way that your character is partly the result of how it's habituated. The habits of life mold your character. And so if you've got the form of work that forces you to confront your own errors, you're going to have a different relationship to knowledge than if you have a form of work that insulates you from the consequences of your errors. This is a critical thing in the formation of your own character. And, you know, when it comes to programming, it was largely luck. I mean, I could have gone into any number of disciplines. And even in programming, like Donald's describing, I could easily have ended up in one of those other categories where, you know, we move on after 18 months and I never have to confront the long-term consequences of my actions. But I still support the code that I wrote in 1986. I mean, you know, all of my bugs come home to roost. There is no escape from the feedback loop from reality that's constantly telling me I should not trust my ideas about even my own code. I shouldn't trust my ideas about. I really need to go back and look at the code itself, and no matter how on top of it I think I am, because it will continue to surprise me. Right? That's the nature of the actual world.
Could I ask
Go ahead.
Donald, you or a question? I mean, the way Donald described it, he was not so much an engineer. Maybe he started out as an engineer, a software engineer, but he was more of a mechanic. And it seems to me a mechanic is fixing things that somehow broke. And if you have either the society's gotten so complex that nobody actually know what the hell's going on, and so a mechanic has to be the final solution, or else it has developed so fast or whatever that nobody took responsibility. So therefore it fails and the mechanic has to come and fix it. So if everything was done perfectly, not that I think it will ever be, then there would be very, very little need for mechanics because he's the kind of the fix-it man in a way. So, what do you think it is? Is it just developing so fast nobody really has an understanding? Because efficiency, pace, that's an important push to society. So, just a question about
So,
being a mechanic.
go ahead, Donald.
Well, you know, this is hard. It's hard to express. I can obtain almost a really good state of autism where I reduce my brain function to the kinds of things that computers do. That I read code I can read other people's code very rapidly and say, oh, this is what they were trying to do. And look, they made the same mistake that I made. All the mistakes I'm able to find and correct. Sometimes younger programmers would be sort of intimidated. And I said, the reason I can do this is because I've made all these mistakes. I've seen them. I've fixed my own, and now I'm fixing somebody else. It's a habit of mind coupled with doing it for a while, and there's no skipping that time. And I think that's kind of what Rick is talking about. Things can be organized so that people skip ever learning from the consequences of their own behaviors. And that's not just in programming. That's in, I've had 4 wives and they were all turned out to be bad. What am I doing? I don't know. Well, maybe they should have stayed with one long enough to figure out what went wrong. I don't know. That's an extreme example, but I think it's sticking around, wanting to see how things come up.
I'm gonna pause here. We've been joined today by Gene Young. Welcome to the seminar. We've been doing this for a few years. We're on we're currently working through a work by philosopher Kenneth Smith called Millennia and Microcosm. We're on week 87. Oh, I put 85. That's not right. We're on week 87. Or is it 88? God help us. I think it's 87. It's in chapter 4 of what's going to be a book that David and I are publishing, which is Kenneth's work with some table of contents and indexes and so on. And it's an attempt to show us how to understand the way that our modern worldview, instead of acting as a perfect, non-distorting, objective lens to reality, actually imposes distortion. So there's parts of reality we don't see clearly. And the way that he proposes to help us do that is to start by teaching us about the lenses that were used, the worldviews that were used, first of all, in the ancient Greek and Roman world, and how they saw things differently than we do. And then once we've learned to do that, then he takes us to the medieval world to see how they saw the world differently from either us or the ancients. And then after that's done, in the end of this book, armed with these 2 alternative lens systems that we hopefully will be at least a little proficient in, we can come back and look at the modern world and how we see things. And things will jump out at us about our assumptions that we never noticed before, that we took for granted as the water that we fishies were swimming in, as they say. And we'll start to understand what it means to be a modern person, and what are the kinds of distortions we have, what are the value systems that we have that we take for granted, but that might not necessarily be so. So you had your hand up. If you want to, come off mute and
yes. So I really was just influenced by this idea that we started off, I think it's a Taoist concept, we started off as yin energy and we want to experience the ecstasy of dividing and reintegrating, so we split into yin and yang. And yang had to do what yang did, which was to suppress the yin, like run over it and divide and individuate and conquer and colonize and oppress. And that's the hierarchy that he's talking about here. And yet we all have our own energetic blueprint. We're like chemistry, we're part of nature. We have a divine expression that can be unleashed and resurrected. And I think we're at this pivot point where collectively we are hitting bottom like an addict with this yang over yin trajectory. And that's why we're at this point of such division. And, like the US's energy blueprint is like a firecracker. And we've got school shootings in, kindergartens and massive homelessness and diseases that allopathic medicine can't even address. And the shift now is towards the yin energy rising, is actually the Asian century where yin energy is concentrated. And like Chinese traditional medicine is able to cure diseases that US has marked uncurable. Like I actually know a Qigong teacher and healer who does this, who was part of a US congressional hearing because he was doing this. And so that's the energy balance that's needed, is more of the yin. And we all can do this individually by tapping into our own intuition, creativity, embodiment. Like these are the buzzwords right now because we're all trying to get to that. And frankly, lately, like I'm doing psilocybin microdosing, and it is so powerful. I feel like the plants, the mushrooms actually are feeling the imbalance and are wanting to be, imbibed and taken in, because their energy can rebalance us on a chemical, energetic level. So I'm excited. I feel very hopeful. And I feel like, each of these ancient cultures probably was much more in tune with their inherent, energy blueprint than modern society, because we're further along this yang trajectory where it's been suppressing that.
Thank you, Jean. Thank you for your comments. Yeah, we spent some time about a year and a half ago looking at similarities between Heraclitus's concept of the logos and the interpenetration of opposites on the one hand, and the traditional Chinese concept of yin and yang and how that operates on the other. And we'll come back to it again. We'll hit it some more in the medieval era. One of the things we'll be trying to do as we talk about the medieval worldview is to go beyond the book a little bit. This book is focused on the European development of history. It's the Hegelian model of history, which was very Eurocentric. But we've acknowledged that there were medieval periods in Africa, there were medieval periods in China and elsewhere. And it was during the medieval period that a lot of what we think of as the yin and yang concept of analysis got formalized. It's obviously older than that. It obviously goes back to the Archaic period. But the as with so much surviving Greco-Roman literature, the literature on Taoism, got heavily rewritten during the medieval period. And so we'll be exploring and sort of untangling again. We'll return to it and sort of look at what would the original conception, of the endless and the rise of yin and yang out of them have looked like in the Archaic period, and how did it get systematized and changed during the medieval period. In general, where there's a lot of overlap between what you said and kind of what we're looking at in this chapter, is this idea that the ancient epoch, which is what we're focused on right now in this book, the ancient epoch was closer to the experiential part of life. They didn't have as much technology as we do. They didn't have as much power. They didn't live lives as insulated from nature as we do. And so as a result, there was more of a recognition that there had to be I'm going to use Phil's term, equivocation between, the systems that we stood up to try to run our lives on the one hand, and the actual systems of nature that were our cradle and support on the other. In ancient Greece, it was just obvious you had to negotiate with nature, and that nature was more powerful. In the modern world, as Gilbert Murray says, you can go through your entire life without ever knowing where milk comes from, as in the 1980s was famously discovered during a survey of school students. So many of them thought that the origin of milk was the grocery store. And that's it. That's where it comes from. How it gets to the grocery store, nobody knew. Their lives were so insulated from farms and cows and, all of the realities of life, that they were able to be fully immersed in this fully artificial, logical system of life. And I think you're right when you say that there are a lot of downsides to that. Hegel talks about that, Nietzsche talks about that, Kierkegaard talks about it, Kafka, and Kenneth Smith in this book is going to talk about it. But the challenge for us right now is in the chapter that we're in, chapter 4, is less to focus on the modern world and more to go back and look at the ancient world and try to see it not as the caricature it looks like to us from our modern perspective, but to see is, can we learn to strip away our modern interpretation of the ancients and see them in their own terms? What did they think they were? How did they think they saw the world? That's how we'll get closer to this kind of this lens system. So in chapter 4, it's broken up into a number of lettered sections. That's what we've been spending 87 weeks going through is these lettered sections, exploring in each case, what is this radically different aspect of the ancient worldview that's hard for us to understand. I'm just going to name them really quick. They're in that link I shared with you. But the first one is this section A, is nature as becoming and as intrinsic truth. And this is this idea that nature is not a machine like Newton thought, and it's not just a junkyard full of resources for us to exploit like the market thinks, and it's not a meaningless thing waiting for us to impose our own desires and priorities upon it, but rather it has its own meaning. It's a source of truth, and everything in nature is constantly changing and becoming something else. And the Greeks believe this so much that the very word for nature in Greek, phusis, means becoming. Like they don't have the idea of, they don't start out with the idea of things that just are what they are and are not what they're not. Everything, has emerged from some process of growth and development on the one hand, and on the other, oh yeah, I'll drop the text in there again for you. On the one hand, that, and then on the other hand, that's everything is not just what it is, but it also contains seeds of its own future. It's in the process of mutating through a process they called aliosis into whatever it's going to develop into next. So we're always changing and transforming. We're never really holding still. And the philosopher Heraclitus says it pretty much straightforward when he says you can't step in the same river twice. So the first step to us in understanding the ancient worldview as different from our own is understanding that to them nature was in a constant state of flowing and becoming. That's the first section. We spent a lot more time on it because there's a lot of implications of those. Pardon me. There's a lot of implications of those perspectives. The second section, B, was called Custom and Nature, Aristocracy and Philosophy, and this is where we talk about the idea that Homo sapiens is a creature that really needs culture, and that we aren't complete without it. Like a cheetah, might have some culture, but they're not utterly dependent on it the way Homo sapiens is. We're like an animal that can be many different kinds of things depending on how we're raised. And so, handling the culture and managing it to be healthy and to make us grow into somebody healthy is critically important to the ancients. Whereas moderns sort of don't really believe culture even exists at all, except as maybe a decoration for life. We think that the important thing is your laws and your rules and your economy. And those are the real things. And then culture is just, I don't know, what you can convince people to spend money on so that you can get rich. We have a really eviscerated concept of culture. And we spent a whole lot of time in section B, but you can read it for yourself. It's in the link there. Section C, form and matter, organicism and arete, is talking about the way that that there is this struggle when we create between what is the material, the matter that we're working with on the one hand, and what is the form that we're trying to impose on it, like if we're a stonemason or a carpenter or what have you. And what we learn through those experiences is that nature is not willing to bend itself utterly to our will. And even when nature is passive, like a stone, waiting for us to carve it, the stone itself imposes limits on what we can do with it. There's things we can do with stone that we can't do with wood. There's things we can do with wood that we can't do with stone. So it means that what moderns think of as sort of empty, meaningless matter waiting for us to dispose of is actually full of meaning, that imposes restrictions upon how we can mediate with it. And that's when we're in the position of authority of being the crafter, the one who's shaping nature. frequently we're in the other position. We're the thing being shaped, whether it's by our culture or by our experiences, or simply because we jump off a cliff and discover that gravity is real, whether we think it is or not. You know, the nature imposes authority upon us, whether we like it or not. And so we have a choice, you know, as to how much we are willing to acknowledge the authority of nature over us. This is one of the places where the ancients are very different from us, and they're very different from the medievals, because they think nature is the ultimate authority. They think even their gods are just expressions of nature, and mankind is at the bottom of this kind of triumvirate of sources of meaning. For us, that's hard to think about, because we think that we're the source of meaning and that nature is an empty, meaningless thing and we can define it as whatever we want it to be. But we're discovering that it's not true. That nature does, there are consequences to our actions, whether we like them or not, and that we are subject to nature, despite a couple thousand years of trying to convince ourselves that we're not. So that was section C. I'll get to the hands after I take you on this quick tour. We haven't done one of these in a few months, I think. Section D is arete, or natural excellence. And this is dealing with the idea that people aren't all the same. There's diversity among people, and it's the same is true for animals or plants or anything else. There's a lot of diversity, and if you look out in nature, you can see that different things have different areas of excellence that they specialize in. And I use the example a lot of a cheetah, which clearly has evolved to run. I mean, from the incredible, see you next week, Sharon. From the incredible flexibility of its spine to the way its eyes and its ears make it, you know, obsessively focus on the thing that it's chasing, from the way that it grows up, to its psychology. Everything about a cheetah is designed to contribute to this excellence that it has, and we don't even come close. No human being, no matter how, not even Usain Bolt, no human being can run as fast as a cheetah. For them, it's just a huge excellence. And likewise, the excellence of the peregrine falcon with its dive that no other bird can match. You know, every different creature has its areas of excellence, and they believed the same is true of people. Different people have different aretes within them, waiting to be developed like a seed of the future. And thus, there is a responsibility that a culture has. You know, a culture can either ignore the diversity in people and try to stamp out a generation of homogenized, you know, worker tools who all pass exactly the same tests and can produce the same amount of wealth under the same conditions, which is what we do in modernity with No Child Left Behind and other kind of uniformed approaches to education. Or we could do like the ancient Greeks tried to do, where they said you have to expose the growing child to a lot of different circumstances and let them run experiments so that you and they together can discover what their arete might be, who they might become, what glorious seeds are within them that nobody knows about until they actually have the experience, and we discover, oh my goodness, hand this person a piano and they start playing like anything. Maybe we should get the piano lessons. You know, we don't know that until we try things. And so there's this question of, is the purpose of the culture to stamp out a bunch of Xerox clones to, you know, like in the modern world, to minimize how much we disrupt the system and maximize how well we conform to the rules? Or is the purpose of the culture to try to create a lot of diverse seed beds and see what wonderful things grow there? And so in this way, the ancients were the opposite of us. And certainly they were the opposite of medievals as well. The medieval program being that everybody has to be the same so we can all be saved. Section E was daimon and eudaimonia. And this is talking about the way that the ancients believed that everything is full of gods, little gods called daimons. F.M. Cornford's book, which I shared a link to up above, talks about this. He talks about the stage of development of Greek thought, where they went through believing that there were daimons everywhere. And you can see traces of it even in the surviving texts. Yes, hi, Syria. Like in Heraclitus, when he says, "Here too there are gods," to the person who approaches him when he's sitting at a campfire far away from the temple. You know, it's like they believe that there were gods of the trees, there were gods of the rivers, there's gods of the rocks, there's gods everywhere. They're daimons, they're called. And they believe that among the places that daimons reside is inside each individual human being. That your character, your hidden nature within you that makes you who you are and that contains the seeds of your future development acts over you like a daimon. It has authority over you like a god. That what we freely choose is strongly influenced by our character, so strongly that it's as though we have a god or a guardian angel whose whole purpose is to rule over us. And they thought you could be lucky or unlucky in your daimon. You could be born with an unlucky daimon, an unlucky character that might lead you to do self-destructive things and thereby warp your potential. Or you might be, born into eudaimonia, have a good character that just naturally makes you curious about the things you ought to be curious about, makes you experiment about the things you ought to experiment about, so that you can discover your potential arete and develop it and become a better person than tomorrow than you were yesterday. They thought that this is the nature of free will and determinism, which is a pretty sophisticated model. The next to last section that we've gone through so far is section F, mythos and logos. And boy, did we spend a lot of time on mythos and logos. This was the hardest one for us to get through. Because to modern people, a myth is a lie. It's like a popular story that isn't true, like the myth of the self-made man. But that wasn't, and so we think of that the process of becoming more accurate about reality is the process of purging ourselves of myths. You'll see references to this definition of myth in, for example, Carl Sagan's series Cosmos. But you can also see it in just about any newspaper. If you pick it up and read all the articles, sooner or later, someone's going to talk about a myth, and they mean a lie. But the ancients believed the opposite. They thought that there are certain kinds of truth that are not easy to talk about, but that are incredibly important. Things about why people do the things that they do, why cultures do the things they do. Those are the sort of things you can't explain through a logical syllogism or through a mathematical equation. They don't lend themselves to these simple, trivial, almost representations. You need some way to immerse people in the experience that you're trying to teach them about so that they can feel at an emotional level the impact of it to comprehend what's going on. So, for example, the classic example in this is Greek tragedy. Why are they trying to, over and over, they're trying to give us examples of people who are heroes, who have great virtues, who get into trouble because of those virtues. And so they're trying to teach this idea that just because you're good at something doesn't mean you can't make a big mess as a result of that thing you're good at. And in fact, the stronger your virtues, the greater your potential to make a bigger mess. They contrast Oedipus, who was the smartest, the brightest, the most courageous person in Thebes, who ends up doing the worst things to himself and his city as a result of that. None of the other Thebans could have pulled that off. Only he was clever enough and dedicated enough and courageous enough to persevere into just making a complete disaster of Thebes and his life. And yet that pales by comparison with Odysseus, who managed, through the deal that he constructed between the Mycenaean kings, to accidentally bring about the collapse of Bronze Age civilization, or at least that's what the Greeks thought had happened. So this issue of the tragic element in which circumstances in our life can create a condition of inversion in which the more effective we are, the worse we make things. This is something that moderns don't like to acknowledge at all in any way whatsoever. We prefer to believe that, good is good and bad is bad, and they stay separated. This idea that there is a close, intimate relationship between them that's extremely uncomfortable is something that the Greeks wanted everybody to learn. They thought it was essential. And so they wrote myths about it, right? And they shared those myths and they popularized them to make sure that every Greek would be immersed in what happens when you don't question yourself, when you take your will for granted, your desires for granted, your cleverness for granted, what horrible things can go wrong. They wanted to make sure nobody missed it because they were desperate not to repeat the mistakes of their ancestors. So mythos and logos, we're talking about the way that we study the Greeks as an example of the ancients because they adopted writing early enough that when they first started writing, they were capturing their earlier, more mythic culture when they still understood how much of life could only be understood experientially. And then they're in the course of transforming into a more logos culture that believes that everything should be explicit and there shouldn't be any role for the unconscious. They want to purge magic and the divine and the mysterious from their worlds and turn everything into a machine and a logical syllogism. And Aristotle works on this hard, but a lot of people before him were doing the same thing. You can even see it in Anaximander and Pythagoras and others. So, we get to see the process in the Greeks. We get to see the process of transformation out of mythos culture and into logos culture and study it to figure out what happened to us. How did we become this way? The problems, Gene, that you talked about, these are the consequences of a transformation like this. But how did it happen? If we can understand how it happened, then maybe we can open up some more choices for ourselves in the future. If we don't know how it happened, then we're likely to fail in our attempts to get out of the trap that we've built for ourselves. So this is why he spent so much time on the Greeks in this section. We finished section F a month or two ago, and we're currently in the section character and class. This is section G. And this is the most controversial part of this chapter. And this is where we're talking about how the ancients believed that the diversity within human beings, the different types of characters, should correspond to a class system, which there are different kinds of classes with people having different kinds of rights and responsibilities. So, for example, if somebody is a habitual liar and con man who can't stop trying to rip people off, you probably shouldn't put him in charge of the city. That's probably a really stupid thing to do. Moderns don't believe that. You look in the Constitution and say, what are the requirements to become president? And it's hardly anything. You have to be a U.S. citizen. You have to, be a certain age and not convicted of a felony yet. But if you believe that, the entire world ought to be destroyed so that you can force God to come back and save us, if you believe that what you should do is press the button and fire all the nukes at once, well, the Constitution's fine with you being president, no problem. We have literally no distinctions between who is and is not fit to rule. And the Greeks thought, well, that's just insane. Of course you need to make these distinctions. So we're talking in here about the background behind how they set up their class system and how they related it to the diversity of human character. The critical part to understand as we go into this is, and this is part of what we're going to focus on today, is the issue of slavery. Is that all of this theoretical framework about human nature and character and diversity and so forth was developed in part as a rationalization of the slave-based society that they found themselves in when they began philosophizing. That is, they wanted to start out by saying, okay, sure, we run around conquering places and killing people and taking slaves, but somehow it's a good thing. And give us time and we'll persuade you. We're gonna develop a theory of human behavior that makes it seem like a good thing that we keep slaves. That's how they started out. But as we argued a couple of months ago, they were hoist on their own petard because their rationalization was so good that they actually stumbled upon some truths about human nature and human character. And as they did, it began to call into question their own slave society. So, for example, Aristotle has parts where he talks about the way that if a society screws up its system of slave castes, it will end up with enslaving people who should be free because they've got the character to be great people and do great things. They shouldn't be doing menial labor. And likewise, you can screw up the other way. And to put in charge of your city, you might accidentally put in charge someone who's just a creature of appetites. And everything that they do will be designed to exploit the city and ruin it for their own short-term advantage. And when he's writing these things, it looks to us like he's just categorizing. But what he's actually doing is offering a critique of what went wrong in classical Greece leading up to the Peloponnesian War. He's saying, this is what we screwed up. We were supposed to be a society in which people who weren't fit to govern didn't get the vote, and people who were fit to govern did. But we messed it up, and we ended up with some of our best and brightest were slaves, and some of the worst among us ended up in charge of everything and ruining everything. And this is where we went wrong. This is his critique. So there's this interesting split in the discussion we're going to have today between slavery as they thought it ought to act and behave and how it could be a good for society, and the actual slavery that they had, which was in many ways an evil that they really shouldn't have had. But they didn't start thinking about it till after they had it, and by then it was too late, and they were busy trying to justify themselves. So this is where we are. The one paragraph in two parts that I shared in the chat is the paragraph that we're on, where he's really starting to, Kenneth is really starting to turn to talk about the structure of Greek society. And I shared another link, which I haven't talked about yet, and I won't yet. I'm going to go do questions first. I shared another link to another book that I'm almost done reading. I've been reading this week, called Reconstructing the Slave, the Image of the Slave in Ancient Greece. This is online. It's free. It's badly formatted. It's just one big wall of text, and so you have to inch your way through it and take breaks to give yourself, give your eyes a break from time to time. But it's a great survey of every use of the Greek words for slave, doulos, anthropodon, oikotes, all of these words. How did they use them? How did they differ from each other? What were Greek attitudes towards slaves and so forth? It's fascinating. And it plays directly into what we're talking about in this section about the different castes and cultures and what they meant. So now we've got questions. Yay. So we'll start with Stephen. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, we're discussing this sort of turning point. What is it? The axial. We're dealing with this axial age proposition. And of course, the general view is this was the rational light emerging out of the darkness. You know, all the terrified inhabitants were running around the darkness, and they discovered rational thought, and they never looked back. But I was wondering, there's a parallel, of course, that we have something, say, like the Aztecs, which were apparently a sort of pre-axial age culture. So we have post-axial age culture running into the pre-axial age. And unfortunately, of course, they found all the Aztec books and didn't approve of what was going on in there and burned vast amounts of them. But this is a great curiosity that we lost this sort of opportunity of understanding what could have been a pre-axial age civilization. Now, having a small discussion about religion in the existential society, and the guy was saying that we should embrace all religions together. And I said, does that include the Aztecs with 1,000 human sacrifices a day? And that upset them greatly, which is sort of my role in life, to upset people occasionally. But has there been any discussion on that proposition? Were the Aztecs a pre-axial sort of people?
Thanks, Stephen. So, yeah, I have another paper I read this week that I would like to share with you, and I will look for it while I'm talking. I've got a tab open to it, and the question is just which of these tabs is the one I'm looking for. But there is a new area of investigation going on in archaeology and history that's beginning to suggest that the Aztecs did not sacrifice 1,000 people a day. The codexes that we have, the Aztec codexes that show these pictures of human sacrifice and cannibalism and so on, the only ones that we have that show that in that form were actually not created by the Aztecs. They were created by the Christian missionaries who drew them in the style of the codexes, and they tell us that they did this. So we know it's theirs, that they did this because they said so. And they said we are accurately depicting, what the Aztecs did, but this wasn't the Aztecs themselves showing 1,000 people a day being murdered and bodies being eaten. This is the Christian missionaries saying, and Cortez's men specifically saying, well, we had to slaughter the Aztecs because they're a bunch of devil worshippers who practice cannibalism and so on. He'd been busted earlier for engaging in slaughter in the Antilles. He got in trouble with the authorities back home, and to get out of the trouble, he began making up stories of cannibalism. He said, well, these Antilles people, they're all cannibals, and then the people back home said, oh, well, in that case, I suppose it's good that you killed them and enslaved them. But by the time he got in trouble in Mexico, he'd gone a lot farther than that, and he just about overthrown the Aztec Empire, slaughtered vast numbers of people. And at home, they were talking about bringing him back and killing him for, being a mass murderer. And so he needed a better argument than that there were cannibals. So he added devil worship. And he got Rome on his side by saying, look, they're all devil worshippers out here. If we don't convert these people to Jesus, they're just going to keep eating people and murdering people. They're killing 1,000 a day and so on. So these same codexes that show human sacrifice also show cannibalism. They show people sitting around eating arms and legs and so forth. They're in the exact same books. And today, no serious anthropologist believes that the Aztecs sat around in dining halls eating arms and legs. They're like, well, that part was propaganda that was created by the missionaries and by Cortez. But we still want to think that the human sacrifice must have been the real part of those codexes. But now there's a new group of archaeologists that are going back to say, well, what evidence do we have that doesn't come from Cortez or the missionaries or from Aztecs that they converted who were eager to please Cortez and the missionaries by saying whatever they wanted to hear? And the answer turns out we don't have anything. There's like nothing. We find these vast ossuaries full of bones, but we don't know if they're graveyards or what. Our interpretation of them entirely comes from Cortez and the missionaries. We see symbols of a priest with a knife, stabbing an Aztec in the heart. And we say, well, there's our evidence. Some of this goes back long before Cortez and the missionaries. We're like, how much more evidence do you need? Well, it turns out that is the hieroglyph that is the word for priest. So every time the word priest appears, they show a guy stabbing a guy in the heart. So you see these images of people stabbing people in the heart all over the place. But assuming that corresponds to human sacrifice is like assuming that in ancient Egypt, if you see a symbol of an ibis, it means there's an ibis everywhere. People are trying to have royal processions, and supposedly there's ibises walking in the procession. Well, that's not it. The word ibis means something. That's just a word that means a different thing. And it was the same with we know that was the same with this word that means priest.
Okay,
So,
it's just
but I'm
wondering.
not quite done. Not quite done. You'll want to hear the last part. You'll like the last part better than the first part. The last part is the argument isn't that they never killed anybody. We're pretty sure they did. But on what scale it occurred, right now, we're in the process of completely overhauling our understanding of who the Aztecs were. So I can't answer your question. I don't think anybody else can right now. But in another 10, 20, 30 years, I think there might be some better evidence coming out that tells us.
Well, it was actually a bit more than sacrifice. This is the question, that the Aztecs were still this pre-axial age culture.
Sure.
And maybe there was that element of the mystery religion or something like that, or there were factors in their social culture.
Yes.
Which were different from a post-axial age culture. And this is the interesting bit, that what was it like to meet a sophisticated culture? We come across the primitive peoples of the world and so forth, but with the Aztecs, we're coming across a pre-axial age culture which has reached the height of a certain sophistication, and yet they're still got the mystery cult going. It's a bit like, say, the ancient Egyptians. The ancient Egyptians supposedly practiced the temple death.
Yes.
Maybe they saw near-death experiences and they thought, oh, this is fantastic.
Yes.
We've got to repeat this. Let's induce near-death experiences and see what they've got to say.
I agree with you.
This is a practice which, of course, later on seems to have disappeared.
This stuff is very interesting. It is.
This is a dramatically different way of viewing the world from the later phase, which was dominated by commerce and money and things which we were familiar with. So this is a great question. What can we actually learn about? What are the qualities of a sophisticated civilization, yet one that was pre-axial age? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up, Stephen. Cornford's book is really helpful here. He talks about the stages of the religion prior to the stage at which we encounter it in classical Greece. And he does a lot of cross-cultural comparison that I think you'd find fascinating, including to Australian Aborigines, kind of looking at the anthropological evaluation of the stages of development. And based on that, one could hypothesize a certain number of epochs, even in Greece itself, a certain number of epochs that preceded the ancient epoch. And right now, these aren't part of Kenneth's book. He wrote this before we had some of the more recent archaeological breakthroughs, and especially the genetic breakthroughs, looking at the peopling of Europe. But we could probably hypothesize that before the ancient epoch, there would be the labyrinthine epoch. And that would be the period of the Minoan, Mycenaean, Aegean civilization. So this is Bronze Age, and they're building very large palace complexes. We inherited the word palace complex from the archaeologists who did the investigation. But we now know they weren't palaces at all. They were these giant complex buildings that were used for religious and economic purposes rather than for rulership. And who was there and what they were doing, archaeologists are still unraveling, but they appear to have been like mass projects for an entire area. You know, people living in villages and on farms would pour their resources into creating one of these things, and then it would act as a hub for, you know, commerce and exchange and religion for the region nearby. So we could see evidence of things like, you know, this kind of concept perhaps among the Aztecs and the Mayans. Perhaps some of these giant city structures that we think of were playing this labyrinthine role rather than a strictly rulership role, which would explain why, in the case of the Maya, they eventually just abandoned them and went back to the village because, you know, they decided they didn't need them anymore. Um, it looks like there was another epoch before that in Europe. Oh, by the way, the labyrinthine epoch, so that's Bronze Age. It looks like there was at least one other epoch before that we have pretty good evidence for, and that would be the megalithic epoch. And the megalithic epoch seems to be associated with the spread of agriculture from Anatolia up throughout Europe. It reached all the way across Europe, ultimately to the British Isles and Scandinavia as well. And of course, these megaliths, as we now know, in addition to whatever other roles they played, they at least played the role of calendars to help synchronize agriculture, to figure out when is it time to plant, when is it time to reap, and so forth. And that civilization goes back at least to 6000 BCE, whereas the labyrinthine probably picks up around 3200, 3100 BCE. So there's about 3000 years of megalithic and maybe 1500, 1600 years of labyrinthine. And then we've got that dark age that we've talked about many times during the collapse. And the classical Greeks are lifting themselves out of the dark age to create the ancient, what we think of as the ancient or classical epoch. And so you can, with this framework, you can read Cornford's book and you can sort of start to match different stages of religious and cultural development to these different, you know, past epochs. If we know that they happened, we can try to figure out, well, where did they happen? What was happening in the world at that period? Why did people come up with these things? And as you say, Stephen, one of the most amazing things must have been when people from one epoch encountered a different people who were at a different epoch, and how did they understand or not understand each other because of their worldviews were so alien to each other. You know, every word that came out of their mouth, even if they're speaking the same language, meant something different than it did to the other side. That's what it's like for us to go back to the Greeks.
I could think of a comparison. You know, back in 1950, Americans went to church, or supposedly did, and had a certain sort of culture. And if you're a Republican or a Democrat, you had different views on politics, but you would still have a beer together and would still express the arts of civilization.
Yeah.
Then the church was laughed at, and so many years later that the Republicans and Democrats rose to the massively wise point of view that really they should never associate with each other, that they were separate tribes destined on a different path.
Right.
They're the sensible ones. Those people living back in 1950 were idiots living in darkness, peaceably associating with each other. But we're the smart ones. We're trying to kill each other.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this actually come out of Gene's discussion of yin yang and your explanation of what we've been doing. And that connects back to actually my question to Donald about the mechanic. I think we live in a modern age. It's almost difficult. I should say almost impossible. Very difficult for us to understand the yin yang, its true relationships. I mean, I don't even understand it, because when you mention societies, you know, like that we have a need for society, my immediate way of thinking about it is the relationships, you know, like kind of like the mechanic. He sees relationship in the different part. I remember I saw a movie called The Mechanic, and it turned out to be a gangster who actually, I guess, fixed the final solution which is to use chemicals to melt down and take it away, a final solution. But that's a relationship between things and other things. And so when you think about software, it seems like, yeah, the mechanic is to fix the symbols, how they connect to each other. But I'm thinking like, seems to me there's another way to discuss it, which is the medium itself. And it's hard to say the medium because we also turn that into like it's a relation between matter and energy. But I'm thinking of the medium more like water or air. It's there, and that's what actually allows the things to happen in relationship. And so if you think about Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. He's, oh yes, television, or radio or whatever. But it's actually beyond that because we objectify the medium into a thing. It's the thing that is able to capture the medium and turn it into television. And so therefore the medium, in a sense, is something much more ethereal. I mean, maybe we don't even understand what it is, but we know how to describe it and capture it. And I'm going to use a metaphor like music. You say, oh, music. Oh, that's Beethoven. It's in the notes. How the scribe of the lines, and he writes it down, and he said, "Oh, that's objectification of it." Or you could say, "Well, no, that's not quite it. But it's in the orchestra, like how it's played. The conductor is translating these notes and conducting the various flutes and violins and so forth. And there you have it. It's objectifying the orchestra. That's how it comes about. No, that's not what it is. It's not just the relationship between these things, but it's actually what comes out and you hear it. I mean, so I mean that's where it really is, and that's hard to comprehend, but you appreciate it, but hard to comprehend because we need to objectify somehow and say, yes, it's in the notes, thanks to Beethoven, or thanks to Bach. They could describe it, and you say you have learned how to use that language and decode it as the decoding, the mechanics, and if you're a violin player, then learn how to do the mechanics, and you could be part of that. But it's actually in experiencing it, and so I'm thinking that it is so hard for me to talk about things without thinking it's the form is really the relationship parts and other parts. Yes, Beethoven wrote it all down. All the parts written, and he even say, play this loud, play this softly. I mean, like, okay, so therefore, and it's the same thing with Newton. Somebody asked him what gravity is. He says he doesn't know, but he could tell you how it works, describe how the parts work. So there's something within the equation that is not describing. That's where the essence is. And it's just hard for me to even think about that in that relationship because I'm so used to form as a relationship, part to other parts. So that goes a little bit beyond the thing itself because it's the energy between these various parts. If you could describe that, that's the essence. I don't think that's what it is. I think that just describes what the essence is. It doesn't say what the essence actually is.
Right.
So I don't think maybe we're just incapable of really comprehending that. For instance, we used to think there was ether, it turned out there wasn't ether, but that was an essence that wasn't there. But we try to objectify that too. It didn't turn out. So how do we get to like how should I say absorb? Oh yes, this the essence, but we don't know what it is. I mean, I think that's part of the problem because we are so used to a symbolic system, a linguistic system of writing that everything is like, if it isn't in that, if it's in the notes that we wrote down, then what the hell is it? When you listen to music, I don't understand the notes, but I could hear it. and I could appreciate it. I understand. And so I think I don't know whether anybody, even the yin yang people actually understand that, but they feel that there's something there that's not just the relationship parts, other parts to the whole. Now, we already described the whole, but there's something that's like, it's like we described the boat, but we haven't described the water that is existing. Being is something that's beyond the description of parts. So even Heidegger, being
Right.
is a relationship that we construct the ontology of how part the parts together, and the foreground and the background, all that. It's like, yeah, but that's getting close, but it's not it. It's not quite it. And so maybe that's why Heidegger never ended up writing the book on being itself. He wrote Dasein and being,
Yeah.
right? Because Dasein is going to objectify it, and it's going to objectify it in words. He did say, the essence of being uh, is the essence of words is that is where being lives. But that's not what being is. Like being as at best your roommate. So there you
Yeah.
are. I think we have trouble understanding what being is, and maybe we never do because it, it's like ether. It's like this thing that you imagine, but it isn't there, but it is there. So I just thought I'd say that. So we are operating on a level that is on a ground that we don't quite understand. So maybe surfing comes closest in a funny way. I'm not a surfer, but surfer seems to like appreciate is more than just the water. It's like being. So
Thanks.
I guess maybe we ought to take up surfing and try to at least capture that in some sense. That's it. I thought I thank
Yeah, it
you,
was
Gene,
good.
for bringing that up, and thank you uh, 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 for explaining it further. And so I thought I'd bring that up. That's why
Yeah.
it's a mystery, and
Thanks
and
for
there
bringing
is
it
an
up,
essence
Phil.
in that. Yeah, and the essence is there. It's just that we can't really
Yeah.
describe it. We're going to experience it. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. No, that's great. And it goes to the heart of the problem. Part of what we're doing in this book is building on the existentialist model of the human mind and human experience that Hegel developed but didn't fully embrace himself, in which we have this much older faculty of the mind, the gnosis, that allows us to immerse ourselves in an experience, to become one with it, and to be, you see it in the cheetah, the way that it watches as it's running. It watches its prey so much that it has to anticipate every left turn, every right turn, everything, or it's going to be hungry. I mean, its choices are, if I'm a cheetah and I want to be distant and feel like I'm my own person, and I can think for myself, then I'm going to die of starvation. The cheetah does what it does because it's so immersed in what it can understand about the psychology and behavior of its prey that it becomes the prey, and every move mimics, and it has to get that union in order to survive. So it's got this huge drive. But human beings have that same faculty, and we experience it like we saw in that early essay in Mythos and Logos. We experienced it as infants as our native idiom of the mind. The infant is a live wire. Everything affects them completely. If they're hungry, it's the greatest hunger that has ever been known, right? It's literally, they haven't been hungry before. This is the greatest hunger that's ever been known. And when they're fed afterwards and they feel full, this is the greatest satisfaction they've ever known. It is. Every experience is a complete immersion. But a human being can experience that any number of ways, even as an adult. And I put this quote from Sir George Grove about Beethoven's Sixth Symphony, his pastoral, in which he composed at the same time as his Turbulent Fifth, and he released at the same concert as his Turbulent Fifth, and yet it gets neglected. But the sixth was his attempt. It was Beethoven's way of saying, in the troubles and tribulations of his own life, nature is a great balm for his heart and a solace, and he doesn't know how he could survive without it. And he wants to bring that feeling to the people who listen to his music. And so he used every gift that he had to create a symphony that would convey the feelings of going out into nature and then walking along a brook in the forest, listening to the birds, and then celebrating in a field and then having it disrupted by a storm coming in. But then the storm blows over, and afterwards, you're feeling the rejuvenation of I've survived the crisis. I'm in a healthy place. It makes me feel sane and whole. And this what Grove is saying is he succeeded. You know, you listen to a great performance of the symphony and you feel all those things in your heart. You know, it's like you said, they're just notes on a page in the score, but and nowhere in those notes do you see the essence of the experience that he's communicating. Even a completely proficient reader of Beethoven's Sixth, unless they've heard it, they aren't going to feel those experiential feelings that the sixth exists in order to recreate in us until it's performed. And then we go on the journey, the emotional journey and transformation that Beethoven had in mind for us. And suddenly, yeah, we're in nature and we're being regenerated. Our soul is being regenerated by the essence of this music, which the notes can't capture, but can only, like the finger pointing at the moon, point the way towards how performers can recreate the experience for us. It's a powerful thing. I now listen to this symphony every morning when I first wake up. It's become I really rediscovered it as an adult only a few months ago, and now it's become part of my daily routine to remind myself about the beauty and the regeneration of life. Jean, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
So what comes to mind with talking about myth and logos, which connects to everything else, is just that myth is the unconscious. And it is also nature. It is also the body. It is also the collective and yin. And I think that the Greeks, in not understanding they had an unconscious as well, and that their, slavery system was not perfect. Like they indicted themselves through their own, exploration. And so their unconscious came up to the conscious. And I actually love looking at different cultures and what their energy blueprint kind of suggests to me. And I was talking with a friend who's of Greek origins, and she's a physics professor and an energy healer, really interesting woman. And I was like, what are the Greeks imprint? Because I always think of the key theme of each culture. China is about the grandness, the massiveness. Japan is like minimalism to the point of implosion. Korea is like this dynamic of suppression and explosion, like all different ways of interacting with yin and yang. And the Greeks, what were the Greeks? And I kind of thought about it as like, they got a lot of triangles, like, the baklava and the layers and the triangles and geometry. And she was like, the Greek knows the triangle. And I think about it as like the block punch to what the British are sort of like the forefront of the yang trajectory. And they were like trying to shift it and trying to make it a little bit softer, like they fit into this whole energy trajectory of the yang running over the yin. And they're in the process. We are all in process and we're all energy. So what I'm thinking is, and what Phil is sharing is like quantum physics, like we're all between the particle and the wave. We think we're particles, we think we're discrete, but we're actually part of this whole. And we have an impact on each other. And we have unconscious connection to each other. So to me, this conversation is making me very aware that there is so much potential that we are not always open to because we're in our ego and thinking that we're separate. So I think it's really amazing, revolutionary times that we're in. And I feel like so much quantum, jumping is happening. We're rapidly evolving, and there is so much potential to actually come together into a different configuration that's more cooperative, that needs to happen, or we won't survive. And then the last thing I'll say is, yeah. And nature is a part of us, and we are a part of nature. Like we have a certain variety of hair, a certain facial structure. We have a lineage. We're not not a part of nature. We are a part of nature, but human beings, we think we're so special and different. We just happen to be placed on this earth. We're actually just a part of it. So there was one more thing I was going to say, something about
Well, when you think of it, put your hand up and I'll call on you again. We're good about everybody gets their say. So
I might have to jump off at a certain point, but thank you. That's pretty much what I got for now.
well, I'm with you on all of that. This is one of the challenges in studying the ancient Greeks is that, the materials that we have left are not a representative sample of what they thought because we owe it to these Christian monks in the medieval epoch. So what did they think satisfied their theology? That's what they preserved. And the things that were in conflict with medieval theology, they tended to not copy and then they just rot away and we'd lose them. So we're sort of, oh, go ahead.
I remember what I was going to say. Like
Please.
the whole concept of society is also like the ego, like our natural unconscious, like in Hobbes's theory, society is a leviathan and human nature is wild and part of nature. And it's been tamed and controlled so that we can function in some way and cooperate in some way, but it also is restraining. And like what I think is happening is if we can all start detoxing from this very, myopic mindset that's served its purpose and start to individuate more in a new way where we really do tap into our own energy blueprints, we can all become accepting of that and more cooperative. So anyway, I just see us as becoming more, breaking out of this structure we've been in of Western domination, patriarchy, and moving into one where there is more individualistic expression that actually is cooperative.
Thank you, Jean.
Sure.
Yeah, the Hegel, we go back to Hegel a lot. He has plenty of terrible mistakes. He thought the I Ching was the complete Chinese writing system. And so he famously botched it when he said, well, there can't be any such thing as Chinese philosophy because nobody with a writing system this simple could possibly philosophize. And it's like, how does it not occur to you that what you're looking at is not the Chinese writing system? It's just the I Ching. There's a whole lot more than that. It completely went over his head. He's Eurocentric. But with these understandings, there's still a lot to be gotten out of him. He was digging in rich veins, and one of the places that he dug was this realization that history goes through developmental phases just like an individual does, and that's where this idea of epochs comes from. That there is this dissatisfaction with the old order, not at the level of like an individual revolution, but like on a worldwide scale that leads to shrugging off the old order and kind of having a revolution in ideas and culture. And then it rises to power, across the entire world, spreading ideas that get incorporated into all the new cultures. Every culture that develops kind of absorbs from the zeitgeist of that epoch and expresses it in some novel way. Like when you were describing how 3 different nations express yin and yang, that's a classic example. If you've got the same zeitgeist underlying it, but it can be expressed in a wide diversity of forms. So it's an exciting time in a new epoch when it's rising. But as the epoch gets more powerful and consolidated, it becomes more ideological because it keeps succeeding. And so it keeps thinking, I must have things right. And therefore, everybody should believe what I believe, because if I don't want them to be wrong, everybody should be like I am. And so you get this, it goes from being a revolutionary transformative power to becoming an oppressive reactionary power. And ultimately, corruption rises within a system like that until it reaches a point where nobody believes anymore in the promises of the epoch. And that late stage is when the most exciting things happen, because people are throwing off their old ideologies because they're just not working anymore. And they're searching for ideas. And partly they search in the past, what's been forgotten, but partly they search in the world around them. What have I not been noticing that's right here that I could be seeing? And most observers who really look at this stuff think that we're in the late stages of modernity. Who knows how much longer the late stages have? They could go on for a while, but it's clear that there's a lot of dissatisfaction with the classical modernist propositions right now. And one of them is this idea that the world is just a meaningless jumble of resources, ours to dispose of as we see fit, and there could be no negative consequences of our actions. Our plans will always be right. We won't accidentally set in motion terrible things that our generations to come will curse us from. The only thing that can happen when we make a plan is, it either succeeds or it fails. And if it succeeds, only what we meant to happen is what will happen. This is the ego talking, right? The ego believes its plans are perfect. And this is what gets an epoch in trouble. Leads to the decay and decline. Hegel famously said, the owl of Minerva, by which he meant philosophy and exploration of new ideas, only takes flight with the fall of night. It's during the last stages of an epoch when everybody at the same time starts looking around and going, this is not working. We've got to find some new ideas. So one of them is this, and this is for chapter 4, this is one of the critical ideas we come back to repeatedly, that the law of the excluded middle. Things are either true or false. You either broke the law or you followed the law. Everything is one thing or it's the other, and there's no mixing of the two. There's this pure state of all one or all the other. This is what our entire economic and political system is based on. And what are you allowed to do? What are you not allowed to do? Did you make a profit or did you not make a profit? Did you pay your rent or did you not pay your rent? And that's the difference between life and death for us as moderns, is whether we can cross these thresholds or not. And the ancient Greeks, if your entire life is incentivized by absolutely separating things into good and bad, right and wrong, true and false, and so on, it will infect every other part of your thinking. You'll dream about it at night. The things that have nothing to do with the law or exchanges of money start to be contaminated by these ideas of, things are either one thing or they're the other thing. The Greeks didn't have this problem. This is part of why it's fascinating to study them. They were a much older culture. They were closer to their roots than we are. And as a result of that, they preserved kind of ancient traditional wisdom that we've long since lost. And a lot of it you can see in Heraclitus when he talks about that opposites can exist at the exact same time in the same situation. Something can be true and false at the same time. And not just as a logical contradiction, but in fact, it may be that if they weren't both true and false at the same time, they couldn't exist at all. He's a philosopher of paradox. He's really into looking at the ways that biological systems always pair up opposites together. So we have insulin to control our blood sugar, but we also have glucagon to control our blood sugar. If all we had was insulin, we'd die. Insulin would cause our blood sugar to swerve the wrong way and we'd die. But we've got glucagon. And so the brain and hormones are constantly responding to the sugar level in the blood. And if it goes one way, then it dumps insulin to create a change. But if that goes too far, then it dumps glucagon to pull a change back the other way. And he said this harnessing of opposites together into a dynamic system like a bow or a lyre is the secret of life. All living systems depend on paradox and on the harnessing of, and of course you're hearing yin and I know you're hearing yin and yang, and you should, right? Yin and yang already captures this idea from a traditional Chinese perspective or an Asian perspective. It's the same concept here, that we think we're walking on simple solid ground where, the floor is either wood or it's not wood. It's either solid or it's not solid. But the more we learn about atomic theory and so on, the more we learn, well, it's mostly empty space. Mostly a force field generated by the matter is causing us to hover in the air. There's so much empty space that if it weren't for these electrical charges of electrons and protons, we'd fall right through the floor. It's almost entirely empty. It's more empty than the solar system. There's almost nothing there. And so this idea that we're walking on a fabric of paradoxes in life, that we're swimming in a water of paradoxes. And if it weren't for paradoxes and this harnessing of opposites together into polyntropy, we couldn't exist at all. This is something very comfortable to ancient culture. They had no problem with these ideas at all. But modern culture, we don't like that at all. We want things to be true or false, right or wrong. Can the policeman hit you with the club or can he not hit you with the club? He has to know which side of the law you're on. It's not okay if you're on both sides at the same time. This is like everything falls apart. Did you make a profit or not? We have to know. That's how we've structured the world. So I'm with you 100%. We're sort of in a period where we're discovering that the sort of trivial-minded, excessive polarization of things into one or the other is leading to systems that can't deal with the real complexities of the cosmos, let alone, human free will. So Joe, and then Phil, and then I'm going to take us to the text. We always start with a half hour to an hour and a half of kind of talking around the text, and then we go to the text, which is what we're about to do. But first, Joe, come
I'll
on.
be very brief because you just took everything that I was about to say. So I literally, but which actually makes me feel good because that makes me think like, all right, well then I'm in tune with Rick, so that's cool. But on the flip side, now I'm left with nothing to say. No, but I just to briefly come back is this idea of good and bad, or even put it the idea of sophisticated and unsophisticated, and how we look at things as to um, uh, as opposed to, as you said, even the law of excluded metal. What that does is coming back to the point that you made a little bit earlier about diversity as a strength versus a diversity as a weakness, and actually acknowledging our differences. And those differences, you find strength, not necessarily weakness, but you find weakness if you have a binary way of looking at the world. So that's where it becomes a weakness. So it becomes the objectification. And this is where I find a lot of it to be, with a lot of it be related to materialism in that sense. So what is it that I can get out of you? And then, yes, you're going to exploit, minority groups. And because why? You'll do that because that's all you're thinking about is the objectification of what you're going to get out of the other, as opposed to how does this work together and work within nature. And I think that, in a way that also goes into the idea of even nature itself and how we look at nature. Some people look at nature as something to be conquered. And then some people, and it's either us or that, or nature, or how do you work within it? And so it comes back to the law of excluded metal that you just had brought up. It's when we're starting to look at things from a perspective, a very narrow dogmatic perspective, that this all falls apart. So one of the things that I think that is really important is you talked about the individual and society itself, and that how do you then reconcile those two? And I think that this is where it gets really interesting, is that I think that it's primarily done through management, through character and virtue. I believe that to be true, because there's an original, there's a nature that you're arriving at a conclusion that kind of emerges where we see each other and work together as a collective whole. And it's perhaps the most effective way, I think, for a society to develop. But then there's the role of myth within that, right? So then how does the role of myth actually play into all of this that we've been talking about, myth as culture? And that can be objectified. And I think that is a problem, is that one of the times myth gets demonized is because myth itself gets objectified, in the sense that we start to say the self-made individual as the myth, as opposed to the myth that actually teaches us something about the world. And so then we start to say what is good and bad. Like we start to say, well, look what this myth has done to us, and start to disregard it, as opposed to saying, looking at it from a more nuanced position as to what has myth done for us and kind of enabled us to do gradually. I think we start to come down and look at it as a lie. But that's a biased way of looking at the world. You're looking at the data in a very biased manner. You're looking at one story, not all of the stories. And so that this is it's kind of where it comes back to this very narrow approach and a way of looking at the world in general. And I also don't think necessarily, I think it happens during different periods of times in different ways this emerges, right? I think that it's, that there is there wasn't a good, like 70 years ago, 80 years ago, oh, it was great. Well, not for everybody, right? There was dogma back then. There was a lot of other things that went on. There was a lot of othering, a lot of things that needed to, take place. like the civil rights movement. So I think that what we're talking about here more than anything else is the objectification of anything, like, is ultimately leads to its demise. So whether it be a diversity objectified, meaning in different diverse groups, instead of out of many, there's one, and there's like, which one? And you start asking is, and what you can produce. Myth can be objectified. Nature itself can be objectified. And so every time we start to, and it comes back to the point you were making earlier, we think we shape nature, and it's like, no, we work within it. So it's, but and this is where I appreciated this whole thing is actually going today now, is that how does the individual relate to society in general is what we're now asking, right? And today we'll be covering, I guess, the idea of what slavery meant back then versus what it means today. And while we may see ourselves as free, are we really free is the really question, is to really ask ourselves, what does freedom actually mean within that context? And I think that the more objectification that there is involved, the more focused we are on just material goods, and not necessarily things like well-being or health, and the health of everything in our ecosystem, that I think that things in that process become commoditized.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, this is some tricky stuff, and it's where it gets really interesting is if Hegel's right that not just the whole forming faculty of the mind, the gnosis, the part that lets us experience things, as Gene says, with a strong element of the unconscious, but in unity, what are all the relationships, and it can handle nuance and complexity. We don't just have that faculty, we also have that other faculty, noesis, which is humanity's stupid pet trick, our ability to abstract and plan and develop systems and organization. That's allowed us to acquire an enormous amount of power compared to the other species. And they have it, but it's always a servant of their gnosis. Whereas for us, we're able to, the metaphor I came up with is, it's as though noesis, the abstracting intellectual faculty, evolved in us originally as a prosthesis to make gnosis more effective. The ability to make plans really helps you do a better job of being a predator. If you can figure out when the gazelle return, to the watering hole, you can get there in advance and wait for them, which is something you can't do if you're 100% immersed in gnosis, right? You need some part of you that could step out of your current circumstances and make plans. The problem comes when we get to where the prosthesis stops being a prosthesis and becomes the master. And then ipso facto, this ancient, mature mental capability that we've had ever since the jellyfish of immersing into the whole experience, that instead of being the master becomes a servant. And we only listen to it when it's convenient to our ideology. And so this is where you get people who are trying to be rational, which they think of as a good thing. And they say, well, no, I'm totally reality based. I have all these facts to support my position. But when you look at it, you realize they've only cherry picked the facts that actually support their position. And they've ignored all the other facts that would have contradicted their position. They're now living entirely in the world of their ideology, and acts as a filter system to prevent them from seeing all of the other parts of reality that would have helped them to understand that they've become disconnected. This is what Kierkegaard writes about when he says a delusion is a state of mind in which the thing you most need to think in order to escape the delusion is exactly what the delusion won't let you think. That's the part that gets filtered out. If I see that, I might have to change my worldview. Ipso facto, I can't see it. I only see the facts that support me. Creating this enclave in the mind. So what's weird is the idea that, and this is where Hegel's a real revolutionary. What's weird is the idea that liability within us is only the opposite edge of the exact same sword that gives us all the good things. It's the capacity to create some space from reality that allows us to plan. If we can't create space, if we can't separate ourselves at all from reality, then we might as well be jellyfish, just immediately reacting to everything, never having any memory or visions of the future. There's this complicated palintropy that has to exist between the two faculties of the mind so that they correct each other. But where we've gone wrong is to unstring the bow and say, no, we don't need that other thing. That's just irrationality. We don't need to immerse ourselves in the experience in a suffering pathos style way. We need to be perfectly in charge and conscious all the time. We need to always have agency and never just submit to contingency. And that's caused us to try to create a homogenized world in which we're always in control. And of course, what are we rediscovering what the Greeks already knew, which is when you're always in control, it means that you're constantly going to be beset by the consequences of your own actions. You never get a break from being tormented by the unintended consequences of the things you did. That's the world we have right now. All around us at all times, every minute of the day, most of our major problems are of our own making. Now, the advantage of spending more time in gnosis is sometimes things happen to you that aren't actually your fault in any way. You had no say. You could say, well, at least I didn't make that happen. It's a volcano. It's not my fault. But the more we create a hyper intellectual, hyper noetic world, the more we create a world in which everything that goes wrong almost is our fault, or our society's fault, or our system's fault. This is yeah. Go ahead, Joe.
Can I say one quick thing? Is that what you brought up was really important. I thought with nature, then how nature and complexity and how we handle that. Essentially, that's handled through. This is where the point that I was trying to make that you made so really beautifully was the idea of character. That's where I think character is, and we've covered that here. Like this idea of character, how that factors in, and then if character doesn't fit in, if you think about the idea of the master-servant relationship that you were just talking about, the servants are no longer informing the master. It's like almost the master's informing the servants and are imposing their will based on their reality, as opposed to actually having a set of principles where you're actually using information to actually inform you so that you can actually function with your blind spot as well as the information that's coming in. And so the thing is that this is where I think that, yes, data and information are absolutely essential, but they're not the only thing. It's principles in addition to that, because where the data informs the framework as opposed to the data being the framework itself. And so that way we know how to essentially, something is telling us something, but we do know that there's something bigger than ourselves. And that's nature. I mean, so, and then how do we work within that? But it all comes back to the way the complexity of the world in that master-servant relationship is actually really important to what even those terms mean. The fact that it's already separating them starts with the problem, the idea that there seems to be a distinction between those two when there really isn't.
Right. Thank you, Joe. Yeah, this is the problem of that Aristotle talks about when he talks about good government forms and bad government forms. The more you move towards the tyrant being in charge, now you have, instead of having a lot of different people contributing their wisdom to the decision-making process, now you've just got this one dude, which means every blind spot he has becomes the blind spot for the entire society. The army, everything that's at his disposal to move is moving with one guy's blind spots with no correction at all. And so he distinguishes between the good form of monarchy and the bad form of monarchy by saying a person of good character who's a monarch will behave very differently from a person of bad character. A person of bad character will assume that the whole point is to be in charge, and now that he's in charge, he can have his way. His desires can act out, and his ego and his plans and his noesis can be in charge. And what bad could possibly come from getting what he's always wanted and having nobody be able to tell him not to do it? But the person of good character understands the first part of having good character is understanding that we have blind spots. And her character is a problem. It's both an advantage and a disadvantage. There's things we'll be good at and things we'll be bad at. And so a person of good character inherently seeks out other people to supplement his perspectives because he doesn't want to be the slave to his own blind spots and appetites, right? So, you want to hear from a lot of other people. And so Aristotle describes how, the monarchy is different with a person of good character because it's drawing in all this wisdom from the society and funneling it through one person instead of one guy and all his vices are suddenly all that the society can amount to. He does that with, shockingly for moderns, he does that with democracy and says, a democracy made up of people of good character is among the greatest of all forms of government. So you've got all these enlightened people contributing their wisdom to the decision making. But a democracy of people of bad character is among the worst of all forms of government because you have an endless number of tyrants playing tug of war for what's going to happen in the society. And, we don't believe that. Right? We look at our Constitution. There's nothing in there about people should be raised to have a good character so that they're qualified to make good decisions. Everything in there is, you got to vote. You got to vote. Who cares? There's no question of yeah. But what are you going to do with your vote? Are you using your vote to oppress minorities? Oh, the Constitution doesn't care, right? That's fine. Whatever. Any vote they want to have. It's no business of the Constitution. So by definition, the United States qualifies as Aristotle's example of the worst forms of government. We have the bad democracy, and we may informally try to supplement it with newspapers and TV programs to teach us about right and wrong, and church and schools. We may try to do that, but none of that comes from the Constitution. It doesn't give us any protections about the quality of character of the people who are voting, or that society should be organized in order to cultivate that character, which, as we saw in an earlier section in chapter 4, is what the Greeks thought was the whole purpose of a culture. Or at least they thought so by the time before the Peloponnesian War. I'm going to call on Phil, and then I'm going to take us back to the text. So go ahead, Phil. Tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, this has been a very, very interesting discussion between the yin yang symbol, actually between the Tao and then the yin yang symbol and the triangle. I'm going to talk about Plato's form, hopefully, to try to, put another element into it. Usually Plato's form, we think of as a divider line between experience, appearances, and the reality, which is the ideas or the concept, so the dialectic between the two. But I actually think the dialectic is the wrong way to describe Plato's forms. I think I've always thought Plato's form was a aspiration. And the aspiration, I think, appears in a triangle. So it has the experience, it has the ideas, but it's actually a triangle that, in a sense, mediates between the two of them. And so, in some sense, he retains some of the more ancient Greek and its relationship to modernity, so in between. So there is within it a kind of not the how should I say the divided middle. And I always thought, like, it's very interesting, like it's very odd actually, like why is one not a prime number? I mean, it's the first number. It should be the prime number, but 2 is the prime number. That sounds like the yin yang to me, right? In other words, somehow human beings or the mind or some form of understanding, it's already mediating the true prime number, in a sense, which is interesting in a sense, like, then I say, well, if 2 is a prime number, the odd numbers are no longer any more primes. They're all odd numbers. How very odd that there are no other numbers except the imbalance in a way. One way you could say is the imbalance between the two, which means if that's the case, then the system is not a kind of balancing act between equal parts, but it's a dynamic balance. In other words, there's always an odd man out. like like uh, the guy that doesn't have a girlfriend, he's always messing around trying to try to in a sense create. So I've always wondered, in art there was always the thought about, like a static balance, like kind of like a scale, one side, the other side. And what the romantics through various ages, so you can say the Baroque is that way too. They call it dynamic balance, to always create movement within the picture, but the movement somehow succeeds in creating a balance that seems to harmonize. So you don't just have movement like flaying around, like going crazy, because that does not create harmony, right? Somehow has come back to some sort of balance between, you could say, the yin and the yang, that way. I actually did want to say that, now that we focus on the relation of yin yang, we don't want to underplay the yang as well, right? I mean, like that would also throw it out of balance. So, in some sense, almost the yang is introducing a dynamism into the relationship. So the yin yang symbol has a triangle. Those little dots in the opposite direction, that's a triangle. So in some sense, there actually is a relationship. I think the dots means that they are interactive, whereas a triangle in a way is more equational, so it's more. So in some sense, it's like an equation, and I'll transform Plato's form into this aspirational relationship with the triangle into the character X. X is the potentiality of what the triangle could be, So in a sense, and I'm thinking like, we can't figure out, what gravity is, because there certainly is something, right? It's X, for instance, like we feel that there is a planet beyond Neptune, and we feel the energy, but we believe there's a planet X. We don't know what the hell it is. We're going to look for it, right? Same thing with the gravity, right? There must be an objective that we could do, and we're looking for the graviton that will explain everything, right? The relationship, of things, and we can't find it, Maybe the graviton is the X that we hope to be there, but is not there. Maybe that's why we can't find it, So if we could find a graviton, yeah, well, all the energies are in balance, right? Because they all have a particle that's interactive between them, but they can't find a graviton. And maybe the graviton is so damn small. Maybe that's why we can't find it. The X. It's a very small X. So on the other hand, so now we're in a quandary. We're in a place where we want to have this thing, so we could objectify it. We believe it is there, but it may be not there. It may be this sort of thing. Well, at least maybe it's beyond our way of understanding. Maybe God knows gravitons. We don't. So I think it's very interesting. It's like the difference between us and, let's say, the yin yang symbol is, in some sense, it's that we sort of believe it, but on the other hand, we want to objectify it. I mean, Western culture that tends to want to objectify things. That's why it's so difficult for us to actually feel this experience as the primal thing. It must be a relationship between the various parts, like if we could only get a government, like the Department of Energy cooperate with the Department of Education and the Department of this and that, we create a balance, right? So we objectify that as a relationship between the parts, and that's a reasonable way to approach it, but it gets into a kind of a, like say the mechanic is the bottom layer of fixing it. Right? Calling the mechanic, he's the only one that could fix the pipelines that connect all these things, right? How the roads are connected. So I wonder if we didn't have that mechanical part, though. I mean, calling the mechanic, then we are, well, like I said, I said, Sharon was here. I said, yeah, it's awfully nice to have poetry and all that that gets a little closer to this nebulous relationship that we experience. But I don't want a poet reciting great hymns when I'm on the operation table. Like, could you wait till the operation is over? Then I would love to hear your poetry. I mean, so I think there is an interdependency. Maybe that you say that puts it on mechanical. There's a relationship between the that that you have to appropriate in the right situation. So
Yeah.
I'll call in the mechanic, or when I'm in the operation table, or when I want to fix my car. I also when I want to fix my car, I don't want to call in a poet. Like I want something done. So I think that we have to learn how to appreciate both sides and not get imbalanced the other way too.
Yeah.
Because as much as you might admire the Australian Aborigines, I'm not sure whether I want to live like an Australian Aborigine. I could admire that part, and I could certainly try to absorb it and learn from it, and maybe incorporate some of it. Nor do they really want to appreciate. Well, they probably don't want to appreciate our way of doing things because they've been oppressed, right?
Yeah,
So
well, and this reflects where we are in our epoch, right? When we get a
yeah,
little further along, we'll be a little less satisfied with the way we live. So
yeah,
the more bad the epoch grows towards its end, the more we grow dissatisfied with its precepts. And at an earlier stage, we're more satisfied with them, and that describes the arc of the collapse of the world system. So there may come a time when we envy the Australian Aborigine. Certainly by the time the medieval epoch was ending, everybody hated it. They're like, this has got to go.
well, one of the things I said about, I think Plato was actually trying to create a balance, in terms of, let's say, music is very important, education. Maybe Plato's wrong. Maybe instead of starting out with music, they should start out with surfing. There you go. You have the
Yes.
dynamism as well
Right,
as the thing itself, too.
right.
There's a thing that you're surfing on. So I
Right.
don't know. Maybe I should take up surfing. I'm too damn old to take up surfing now.
Well, maybe
But
you love
maybe
it,
if I
Phil.
heard this at these talks when I was in my 20s, maybe I would have go and get a surfboard and
You'll have to find out. Maybe you'll love it, Phil. Give it a shot. I'm going to take us back to the text now. We're at the 2 hour mark. It's an excellent point to begin the text. I think we've set it up well. For Mary Jo, welcome to the seminar. We're on week 87 of we're working our way through this book by Kenneth Smith, philosopher Kenneth Smith, called Millennia and Microcosm. We're in chapter 4, which is trying to paint a picture of the ancient worldview. Now, how did people in that epoch conceive of themselves and the world in ways that are radically alien to the way that we do? We're trying to learn to get outside of the modern perspective and to look from the ancient perspective. And chapter 4 is broken up into lettered sections. We're in section G, character and class, which builds on the earlier ones. And in the paragraph that we're in, we've just finished talking about how the Greeks took for granted that there were 4 elements that made up the cosmos, and that the elements were differentially dense, which caused layers to the cosmos to appear. There's a diagram of it in the link that I shared with you. And they believed that hierarchy in the natural world corresponded, as he's about to say in this paragraph. They believe that was the justification for why there should be a class system in ancient Greece, that people had different characters, that corresponded roughly to the elements, and as a result, they had different capabilities, and they would naturally sort themselves according to their qualities. That's what we're about to get into. And it's not about justifying it, it's just about trying to get to understand how did they see things. We want to learn to be able to put on the glasses of the ancient world and see things the way they did, and then take them back off again, and shift worldviews. That's what this book's about.
So one of the questions I have is, how did they know about all of the elements way back then? How did they know?
It's a good question. So they didn't know about all the elements that we know about. And they were, for them, the word element was used differently. The 4 elements that they thought about really correspond to what we call the phases of matter. So solid, liquid, gas, and plasma or energy would be the 4. And so they equated them with earth, water, air, and fire. Which is the way that they mainly saw them expressed. But that's what they're talking about, is kind of these different kind of densities of matter, and how they're reflected. So that's where they start out. And so based on that, so let's dig into the text here. Kenneth writes, Greek society was also articulated into such a natural hierarchy, just like the hierarchy of the 4 elements. That is, its class strata were castes, or a system of rank, grounded in the natural character of each individual's personality type. So in this opening sentence, he's talking here not about how the slave system got set up in ancient Greece, but how they rationalized it later on to try to make it a just thing instead of an unjust thing. And to make it into a just thing, it would have to be that people are slaves not because you force them to be, but because it's in their character to be slavish. And in trying to rationalize it in this way, they're accidentally discovering that, in fact, there are people who are slaves of their appetites and their desires, or slaves of their will and their plans and their ideologies. And they think that they're free, but when they act freely without any compulsion at all, it's indistinguishable from being enslaved, right? You have people who are, and I know this from growing up in my own family, where, we have alcoholism as we got a bad gene in our family. And unlike my wife, I can't drink alcohol. None of us can. Or else the bottle rules us. It takes us over. And we become slaves to this desire that we have. So for me, that's been able to act as a metaphor to understand what Heraclitus means when he says, desire is dangerous for us because it acts like, on the one hand, an intoxicant, but on the other hand, like a master. And we become the slave. All of our thinking, all of our planning, all of our feelings start to revolve around how to satisfy the desire, even when that's inappropriate. We find ourselves wanting to do it. So the Greeks are arguing that when someone has that kind of character, they're a slave whether you enslave them or not. They're already a slave, right? Their behavior is less about free choice, the way that we could see it expressed, in the most mature adult people around us, and it's more like a symptom of this part of their character. This is what the Greeks are arguing, and they argue that the same is true around fears or emotions, and really any emotion. If somebody's attracted to somebody and they can't stop themselves from harassing that person and always following them around, they're a slave to their desire, right? Or if somebody has never learned how to deal responsibly with their anger, then they're a slave to their anger. Every time they get angry, the anger makes them do things that later they regret. But they say, it's not my fault. You made me do it because you made me angry. You hear that a lot from people who have anger management problems. And the same is true for all these things. One of the things the Greeks were most concerned about as a warrior culture was being a slave to fear. Right? They said people who let themselves be dominated by their fear are already slaves, whether you enslave them or not, because they will act mechanically in response to fear. They'll do whatever they can to avoid the thing that they're afraid of. And this is what caused the late kind of classical era fad for Greeks killing themselves in the marketplace, to show that they weren't afraid of fear, that they weren't slaves to their fear, that they were free people. It was done out of this belief system that there was nothing worse than being a slave to your emotions or appetites or anything else. So they wanted to prove that they weren't. There's an element of that we see in the modern day, like during the Vietnam War, when monks would light themselves on fire to protest the Vietnam War. This is their way of saying, I'm not acting out of fear. I'm not afraid to die. I'm not afraid of those things. I'm acting out of principle. So listen to my message. We inherit these things from older cultures that have this idea about not being enslaved by fear. So this is what he's talking about in here when he's talking about these castes, is that the Greeks developed this conception that there are people who are ruled by their appetites, ruled by their emotions, ruled by their ideologies or economic systems, what have you. And there are other people who are capable of thinking orthogonally to the demands of those things that enslave the other people. They see these as different character types. And they see this as not you caricaturing that person or claiming that they're like that. This is them saying they're like that whether anybody ever notices or not. It's like, the rock's tendency to just sit there. A pebble on a beach just sits there unless it's acted upon by a wave, coming and rolling it to a different location. That passivity is not us caricaturing the rock. It's part of the essence of the rock. It's its nature. And of course, as we saw in section A, kataphusei, as Aristotle says over and over and over, according to nature, is supposed to be the strongest argument to a Greek. To say, you don't have to listen to me or my persuasion. You can just see for yourself when you look at the thing that that's its nature. This is why Heraclitus, near the opening of his book, says, listening not to me, but to the Logos, we can see that all things are one. He says, my argument doesn't matter. I want you to look at nature and see, what do you see there? So this is what he's talking about in this opening sentence. He's saying the Greeks thought that this hierarchy that they were discovering of character types within people was according to human nature, that we had evolved this way. And it must be functional in us. It must be essential in us for some reason. And it doesn't matter, the worst thing you can do, according to this ancient ethos, is to act in opposition to nature, because you're setting yourself up for tragedy. So what you should do is not pretend that everybody is the same, but you should try to come up with a just society that, that allows each character type to express itself in the healthiest way possible. That's kind of the background behind the sentence. Joe, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, it's interesting because, like, in a way, they set up an approach that categorized things to a degree, but stopped and knew when to stop. And the reason why I say that that's important is because even some of the examples of somebody that has very difficult times, difficult time in controlling their drinking or something. I'm just using the example you gave, and then so so, but that's like an immediate feedback loop. So, but there's deeper than that, right? It's, well, I've conquered that desire. That doesn't mean you've conquered yourself, because there's still that higher level that you're functional now. Now, what are you going to do? It's the idea that it's constant. It's a reoccurring loop that's feeding back. So that the categories serve as this higher self, but the self is like this idea that you're actually ever going to fully achieve full knowledge is really kind of obviously not true.
Right.
And that's where it comes the distinction between modernity and ancients.
Yeah.
It's the idea that I have the knowledge now. Oh, I've conquered, I've gotten all of this. I understand the world just as it is. I know what it looks like. And it's like, no, you don't.
Right.
You're just really effective in the world you live in. And so doesn't mean you've conquered anything. And so in some ways, we become most dangerous when we become most effective. And if we don't realize that, then that's where the hubris and the danger really kind of comes in. And that's where it's there's a hierarchy, but there's no peak.
Right.
There's not that, it's important to make that distinction.
Right.
And this is why, that, we're a loop, and
Until iterative forever.
and yeah, and all the more reason as to why, that's not something that's rule based. That's character. And then that's contextual to each individual, and so with that, there's, again, you're just kind of not only just appealing to what's observable, because what happens is even if things really work out, it may be, may not be the right thing.
Right.
So, and that's where things are both true and false.
Right.
So that's that it can be both true and false. So don't think you really are doing everything right.
Yeah.
Because then you fall into the trap of actually, well, I found what's true. No, you haven't. There's no so it's kind of that hubris that exists in all of us, and it exists at numbers of levels. And sometimes those immediate feedback desires, those harmful desires, those desires are always dangerous. At every level.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, that's right on. This idea that Sisyphus rolling a boulder uphill for eternity isn't a punishment, it's a reward, because the alternative is to sit at the bottom of the hill and not go anywhere. And that, to be an Aristos is to struggle lifelong, to always try to learn more and do better, because as finite beings, we're never going to arrive at a complete comprehension of an infinite cosmos. It's not possible. You can't fit the one into the other. It's never going to happen. And as Heraclitus says, we struggle because, in part, we not only have to explore the infinite cosmos around us, we have to explore the infinite cosmos of our own character within us, which is every bit as hard and as big. And so we're rolling boulders up two hills at the same time, trying to figure out who on earth are we and what on earth is this world that we're in, and how do we overcome our current generation of delusions to free up energy to learn to struggle with the next generation of delusions, the layer underneath the layer we've peeled off. It's still there too, and also needs to be explored. It never ends except in death, which is, the better ending, or it ends in complacency and hubris and tragedy, which is the worst ending, right? So the Greeks are right there with you, that you're supposed to just keep at this, and that this is what distinguishes the three character types that they're seeing, is that the first two character types are busy looking for easy answers so that they can get to the answer, get their trophy or medal or whatever, and be done and say, yay, now I'm an adult and I don't have to think anymore. And I don't have to struggle anymore. And I don't have to feel insecure and unsure and embarrassed anymore. It's like, well, then you're not an adult. Because the heuristic perspective is that you're always going to have this element of the child. You're going to have this playful element for the rest of your life, because you're never going to get to a finish line, because there isn't one. You have to keep digging.
Really, I'll be really quickly, but I was at a conference, at a very prestigious place, and somebody said, well, I'm not so arrogant as to, and very, very nice, very kind individual. So I'm not so arrogant to realize that that we have all the answers at this point in time, because I'm willing to say that it's 5%, and I'm like, where the hell's that number coming from? Like, that I didn't sit there and ask that, but I thought to myself, 5%. We have no idea. It's like there is no that means you're insinuating that there is some 100%, and I was like, that's really not. I was like, oh, this is scary. And so for a moment, but just that mere acknowledgement, oh, that we have more information. You just have, that's not the way the world works. And anyway, that's just it's a notice. It kind of points to how real it can, this gets at certain points.
Yes. I'm there with you. I have the same kind of reaction when and usually I'm hearing the opposite. I'm hearing people saying, I don't know everything. I'm sure there's something left that I don't know. It's like there's only 5% of ignorance and 95% of knowledge. And I'm like, it's not percent, right? It's per infinity. I've been alive for however many years I've been alive. What percentage of infinity is that? Well, it's 0%. It's better than not knowing anything. And God bless every little bit that we struggle for and get and manage to do better on. But let us not fool ourselves that we have become masters of the cosmos who understand everything. We neither have the lifespan nor do we have an infinite consciousness. If we would need both of those things at a minimum in order to even approximate infinity, and it's just never going to happen. It's not the human condition.
No, you're absolutely right.
So I'm with you on that. Yeah, and the Greeks are fine with that. They're fine with the idea. It's a big world, and they're little people, right? The mortal versus the immortal, the finite versus the infinite is the single most dominant recurring theme throughout Greek religion and philosophy. But in the modern world, we hardly want to acknowledge it at all. We want to pretend that the universe is a simple machine. Learn a few rules, and you're done. Now you can have nukes. Yay, we're the winners. And,
the problem comes when everybody thinks that they can close that loop.
Yes.
No matter who they are.
I'm done now.
I'm done. Or I got
my degree.
This is the answer.
Right.
Because then at that point it becomes every problem has its own solution, and every nail, every problem looks like a nail, and you have a hammer.
That's
so
right.
It's like
I must be done learning, because now I've realized it's all nails. There's nothing else. Everything fits my hammer perfectly, and therefore I have ultimate knowledge.
Yeah.
Thank you, Joe. Phil, then Stephen, then Donald. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, to me, it seems a little bit more complicated between the finite and the infinite, eternity to temporality. Because it's a three-dimensional chess. Because you have ecosystem within society itself that has its own structure. I would call that, like Hegel's structure, I suppose, in which it's kind of a medium cycle. It lasts longer than you, but shorter than today. Okay. So you have to learn how not only negotiate between eternity and temporality, which is hard enough as it is. I suppose maybe the Neanderthal man had a simpler in some sense, but it's also a harsher condition. But in contemporary condition, you have to actually learn how to play three-dimensional chess, because you could be working for the eternal cosmic order, but you could work on it in jail. No problem. You'll violate the constitutional order. Let's put it that way. Linguistic order somehow, So you have to not only learn how to dance around it, you kind of have to tippy toe sometimes, because so I do not believe I would advise anybody who doesn't pay attention at all to the social construction that things are going to go smoothly. They could do it. I mean, I suppose there's still maybe some virgin land left in the Northwest Territory of Canada you could go to, and nobody will bother you. You could do what the hell you want, okay? Or Siberia. Well, Navalny got sent to Siberia to see what happened to him, right? And to me, he is a virtuous guy, but nonetheless, yep, didn't obey the social construct of the day. So I think it's a little bit more complicated than just doing the right thing, because the right thing has many, many prongs in it, And so I think to make that dance, essentially, it's kind of like doing a kung fu struggle, except I've seen it. Instead of doing on the ground, they set up a bunch of posts in the air, dancing around the posts. I mean, that's how difficult it has become, because you got this other factor. Like the factor, by the way, there's always changing, depending on what judge you have. It's kind of like you're kind of rolling the dice as you're doing kung fu. Better be careful. So I would advise that that's a little bit more complicated than just doing the right thing
That's right.
in the eternal order. That's
Thank
it.
you, Phil. Yeah, I mean, doing the right thing just it's like pragmatism. It's an answer that doesn't answer anything. It just raises it circles the question back around again. It's like, well, what do you think is the right thing? I mean, Torquemada's idea of the right thing gives me the hives. But he believed fervently he was doing the right thing, so you got to be careful about this stuff. I'm with you completely. Stephen, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, I'm just going to say that, sort of going around on the Zoom sessions and listening to people in meetings. Now, we do hear the claim in this particular text that there's not many true aristocrats around anymore. Now, I go to a lot of meetings and I get the feeling a lot of people seem to be talking from the level of the great good will be how to maximize our pleasure. And I get the feeling I seem to be in committees which have the slave mentality. Not that I put myself above it, because I've spent most of my life having the slave mentality. Or the sheep, it's like the sheep are getting up and discussing, well, what are we going to do next? And this just seems to be the approach which has become so prevalent today. You didn't quite hear as absolute today. If you listen to or look at conversations from 100 years ago, people didn't immediately fall for the siren song of pleasure. But now we have Western leaders talking about the Ukraine war from the aspect of what's going to be the most pleasurable outcome for Western culture. And I wonder about this, that everyone's talking this way, that the greatest good is the greatest pleasure. And well, I wonder, since I'm a bit of a believer in reincarnation, that, well, if I came here seeking the greatest pleasure, well, no. Well, didn't Millennia say that the smarter move is to never be born? So there's something going on here than simply pursuing the greatest pleasure, is my point. But I look at Western civilization at the moment and it looks straight out of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy is a big one for me. Time and time again, you come back to Douglas Adams' little axioms, which he's repeated, and you end up with the Golgafrinchians discussing how to run things. And yeah, it's all about, the greatest pleasure and everybody getting what they want, me get. Instead of, say, the Greek axiom, the best way of driving somebody is insane is to give them everything that they want.
That's
like
right.
a rock star.
That's
I'll
right.
have all the girls I want, all the drugs I want. 10 years later, I'll just look great, won't I?
Not like a burned out wreck.
Yeah, that's the worrying bit, isn't it? Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. Yeah, that's a recurring theme to the Greeks. I mean, there's so many different roads to tragedy in Greek literature, but the surest road to tragedy is to just, relentlessly pursue what you want. This is like, that's just like I think it's part of the temperament of modernity that we can't understand the genie and the lamp. We just don't get the story. We think the purpose of the story is that the genie cheated you. Oh, he took what I said literally. That's not what I meant. We think that's the point of the story. And the point of the story is no. He doesn't take what you say literally. He gives you what you want. I mean, not in some rules lawyer way. You actually get what you want, and that's the problem. We want stupid things, right? We're too we're and we want things that we haven't questioned enough. We aren't actually pointing the right direction. Uh, so anyway, thanks for bringing it up. Douglas Adams, yeah, he's hilarious on these things. Donald, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind. And then I'm going to take us to the second sentence.
Oh, that'd be nice. I shouldn't delay that.
No, go right ahead.
No,
You haven't
no,
spoken today.
but there's a parallelism between paragraph 5 and parallel 6 in these hierarchies. And even moderns probably think that the hierarchy in nature is real and has some consequence. But we would probably say it's just an analogy that it applies to human beings. It's not, we're not as much a part of nature because we're not part of nature. You know, it's hard to say from a Greek point of view. Well, in the first part, everything's a part of all natural things, created things are part of nature. And in the second, we would like to look at that and say, no, we're not. So that puts us in, for moderns, is we can recognize that that due to nature, there is a diversity of individuals with no difference. Whereas in paragraph 5, the Greeks recognize if there's a diversity, it's because there's a difference from phusis, and I just, I think that's pretty, these two paragraphs side by side just put me, well, Kenneth isn't suggesting this is an analogy. He's suggesting this is that at least the Greeks thought this was real. Now, the other thing I was going to say on all these things, as Plato has the same sort of organization as Aristotle on, the one, the many, and the all, the democracy, oligarchy, and monarchy, or whatever. But in there, he says there are three, and then there's a mirror image of three. And there's a good democracy and a bad democracy. And then below that bad democracy is a sort of bad oligarchy. And below that is a bad tyranny. So if it gives you any consolation, Rick, things could get worse.
And probably will.
There's still a couple of rungs left on that ladder. We haven't, and we haven't gotten to the bottom yet. But I think it is important to understand this. This is not an analogy. We're not saying there are different types of human beings because they're different states of matter.
Right. We're
saying that phusis, when it differentiates, is pointing to something real. Phusis is the source of truth. Well, we had that in a prior
section A.
Yeah. And phusis, at least if we look at it from the Greek, is trying to tell us something about ourselves.
Right.
And modernity is shouting back, no, we prefer diversity without a difference. Not that. Okay, enough. Now go on.
It's good stuff. Diversity that doesn't matter, right? That's the modern conception. We're all the same because we're all different, but we'll have the same law for everybody.
Right.
We have a schizoid perspective on these things compared to the Greeks.
Yeah, I have. Someday I'll talk about that. I have a bunch of things on, because when we get, as we get into character
Yes.
and these divisions
Yes.
and stuff, there are going to be two issues, I think, that arise. One is ad hominem arguments, where we argue for or against things based on who said it.
Right.
And if an Aristo says it for the Greeks, that carries more weight than a doulos saying it. You know, it's not. And the other, which it's kind of an Hegelian point where it seems like we're going around in circles. You know, that we're constantly begging the question by going back to some authority. And by begging the question, I don't mean that would be nice to ask. I mean, it actually is going in a circle.
Right.
That one of the places where I think Hegel probably had it right in a very strange way, that every philosophy must be able to explain its own origin. How did the philosopher that came up with this philosopher come into being in the first place?
Right.
And therefore philosophy becomes history that comes around to the philosopher and then to his philosophy, which then considers this whole loop again. And all systematic thinking, and contrary to all ideological thinking, does try to take in everything.
Yes.
And give an account of its own origin, which ideological thinking can give an account of its own origin. It just would prefer not to, or it would prefer that other people not call it on it. But anyway, this is good stuff here. But I think this is hard stuff, especially that, you know, if nature differentiates and it differentiates us, what is the truth in that differentiation? Let me get back to that's good.
Yeah, that's right on. You know, that it's part of the reason it's not a metaphor is that if we are actually different, then we had better address those differences or they're going to trample us. This was the Greek concept of the sacred. There are parts of nature you ignore at your own peril. And if you ignore those things, tragedy will ensue. And you maybe can't even call it tragedy. It's almost comedy in the Greek sense. You know, comedies weren't to laugh at and have fun. Comedies were, this is horrible. It doesn't rise to the level of tragedy. Nobody here was noble. It's just it's too awful to rise to the level of being a tragedy. In the modern conception, just like mythos, we've redefined tragedy to be any bad thing's a tragedy. Oh, my sandwich fell on the ground. What a tragedy. You know, it's like, you know, a volcano went off and you know, 800 people died. That's a tragedy. It's not a tragedy. It's a volcano. Now, if they had the technology to prevent volcanoes from erupting and they chose not to use it because they were too busy, you know, making sandwiches for themselves, expensive sandwiches, you know, then maybe there's some element of being placed on your own petard. If you raise it to a higher level, that they had some, you know, noble reason to ignore the volcano, and then ultimately they were placed on their petard. Now it starts to enter the realm of tragedy. But if it's just, you know, bad things happen, that's not tragedy in a classical sense. That's just bad things happening. They were very familiar with that. Tragedy is all about the inversion, that your virtues are working against you. That's what tragedy is about. Being smarter makes things worse when you cause the collapse of Bronze Age civilization as a result. That's a tragedy, you know. But I tripped and stubbed my toe, even if it's falling off a cliff or an airplane crash. That's not a tragedy. That's just bad. So I'm with you. So here he's trying to underscore the Greek concept that if nature has these authoritative differences, in the nature of things, in their character, and we discover that there are different characters in human beings, then we have to pay attention and do something. We have to do the right thing about that. We have to harmonize with that, or else we're setting ourselves up for catastrophe. So I'm going to do the next sentence and then I'm going to call on Phil. So don't forget what you're going to say, Phil. I'm coming back to you. Oh, so here we have humans inherently tend to gravitate by their own free preference. Right here, this is harking back to the earlier section on daimons, right? In which the distinction between free will and determinism is, we discover that the ancients understood it in a very nuanced way. The free exercise of your will is the leash that keeps you from having free will. Your character is what suggests to you the desires and the things that you notice and the plans that seem reasonable, and therefore you're a prisoner of your character. And so the only free will that you can have is if you can learn to, cultivate your own character to change it so that you can change your fate. If you don't do that, then you're not free. It is through your freedom that you're not free. So that's what he's meaning when he says humans inherently tend to gravitate by their own free preference towards certain kinds of work, certain kinds of actions, work, concerns, and levels of competence and understanding, taking on responsibilities that feel right and shunning others. Right? So you see this, I've often talked about the two Achilles heels of logic as a system. Part of the reason why something being valid is completely unrelated to whether or not it's true is, on the one hand, why did you start with these premises? Where did those premises come from? And the answer is someplace irrational is where they came from. Someplace I can't defend is where they came from. But I'm going to defend after them. Then I'm going to start applying the rules of logic. But the other Achilles heel is the conclusion. Why did you stop there? Of all the places that you could have stopped in your logical derivations, why did this satisfy you? And as he alludes to here, levels of competence and understanding, well, it just irrationally felt right to them. This was what they wanted. This is where they were trying to go the whole time. They weren't engaging in logic for the sake of the truth. They were engaging in logic for the sake of their desire, which was to get to this point. And now they've rationalized a way to get there. And so what you have is, a rational filling to a sandwich in which both slices of bread are irrational. And thus the Achilles heel of logic. Where you started and where you ended were both irrational. It's just the rules to get from one to the other that were rational. So the same is true here when he's talking about levels of competence and understanding. How far do you question? How far do you ask about the meaning of life, about whether your desires are good or bad or somewhere in between? How far do you investigate philosophy? Questions of epistemology and axiology and ontology. And the answer is, it's your character that just makes you feel satisfied with getting to a certain point and make you impatient if someone tries to push you to look deeper than that. Then you're like, this is just gibberish. You're over intellectualizing things. Your question, you could see the panic and frustration set in if you try to push somebody past the level of understanding that they are constitutionally in need of and desire. And they go any further and they don't want that. And they can't explain why in a way that actually holds together, because it's not actually a rational decision. It's their character in action. We've talked before about the role of the unconscious in making it possible to be rational, especially the role in controlling what we notice and don't notice in the world around us. And that the action of nescience, of suppressing almost every part of a picture, so that only 7 plus or minus 2 things remain, a small enough number that our tiny little noetic conscious mind is now capable of thinking about those things. That is an infinite power that our gnosis has. The suppression, the laying down the field. And that comes right out of our character. Two people looking at the same situation are going to suppress different things because their character makes them care about some things and not others. So it's a preconscious, completely irrational function of the mind that makes reason possible. and it arises directly out of character. You can't make somebody not notice something nearly as easily as you can make them notice something. And making them notice something is a non-trivial problem. If somebody really doesn't want to get something, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make them drink. They may just deny that that's the real thing. They may accuse you of manufacturing an argument, right? But that's still easier than making somebody not notice something. That just comes right out of who they are, that they don't see that, whatever that thing is. It's just invisible to them. And therefore it's not a concern, and it can't be a priority, and they can't act on it. It's gone. So this element, especially he talks here about work. Here's a link to Hannah Arendt, The Human Condition, on the Internet Archive. Anybody can get a free copy of it. And it's an indispensable work for understanding Kenneth Smith. He spent a lot of time looking over Hannah Arendt and her work. And in this, Hannah Arendt lays out the three domains of the ancient economy. The oikos, which is the household, the realm of the slaves, the realm of meeting shameful biological needs for food and cleanliness and excretion and so on, reproduction. All of that was considered the realm of the oikos, and the Greeks were ashamed of it, right? They thought it's not divine to have these bodily needs, and so they tried to wall them up in the house along with the women and the slaves and say, we shall not speak of it. You can't be a free person unless somebody else is doing all that work for you, so you can be free to go be a person. This is what they thought. But then the next realm is the agora, the realm of the marketplace, where people are crafting things, they're learning trades and disciplines, and buying and selling. And this was also an iffy proposition to the Greeks. So like, when people start thinking about how to make more money from their neighbor, they start behaving in unfriendly ways, which is why they put the statues of the three graces, the charities, up where all the people in the market could see them. As Aristotle says, to remind everyone that the proper purpose, the natural purpose of trade is not to get one over on your neighbor, it's friendship. You're supposed to be friends with each other, not looking at each other as predators and prey. But just the act of engaging in those things corrupts you so much that unless you've got a reminder saying, hey, remember, that's not your prey, that's your neighbor, people will just naturally slip into trying to exploit each other. How do you keep the market from being a con game? So this is the second realm. And then the third realm is the realm of politics, where we actually try to make the best decisions for the entire polis, and not just for personal gain and not just for personal pleasure. And these three realms are spelled out in the human condition, including some of the Greek terminology that Kenneth uses. It's in the human condition. I asked him about this on Friday. I said, where did you get this terminology of douloi, banausoi, and aristoi? I mean, if I'm trying to, backfill your work and and point to the who talks about, does Aristotle talk about this? Does Hannah Arendt talk about this? And this is what he said, right from the horse's mouth. He said, there wasn't a single source. He says, this whole thing about the three character types and the three realms of the economy, it's the sort of thing you can only notice about the Greeks when you've been immersed in them for a very long time and read an enormous amount of material. He says, if you just look for one work or two works or 10 works, that will be enough. You won't notice it. But if you just like gratuitously keep adding more and more works, read the lyric poets, right? Read the epics, read the law codes, just spread yourself out in exposure to the Greek stuff. He says you begin to notice between the things they say, the assumptions that they would have to make it right for them to say those things. There's this background filigree of assumptions that starts to come into focus the more you see the pattern of the things they talk explicitly about. And he says that's where you're going to find the douloi, the banausoi, and the aristoi. They might occasionally mention one, they might occasionally mention two. They rarely mention all three at the same time. And this issue comes up in that book I linked to earlier. No, not that one. Reconstructing the Slave, right? Reconstructing the Slave, the image of the slave in ancient Greece. I mentioned that. I'm going to drop the link one more time just for the end, because in this work, they talk about many of the different terms, but the authors are puzzled. They haven't read as widely, they haven't immersed themselves as deeply. There are moments when they're puzzled because they see the Greeks talking not just about slaves having a slavish psychology, but even craftsmen and traders who they say are free people. But somehow, for some reason, the Greeks keep treating them as though they have a slavish mentality. And the authors of this book go, that's weird. And then they move on. But Kenneth Smith sees that stuff and goes, aha, they didn't trust either one of them. Like both of these mindsets, both of these character types are hazards. This is kind of, this is what he's talking about. This thing emerges gradually. So this is what he's alluding to when he says, their free preference, their own free preferences towards certain kinds of actions, work, concerns, and levels of competence and understanding. That how much responsibility feels like the right level of responsibility. Only certain characters are going to feel like pushing a boulder up a hill for eternity. For the other two character types, that sounds like a punishment. To the majority, they're like, why would you work that hard? Working hard is bad. The goal is to not work, they think. Why would you want to labor? Only the Aristos says, if I stop laboring, I'm going to become an idiot. I need to keep working on this problem of my delusions and the ways in which my character lets me down. I have to keep cultivating that thing through the rocky soil, or else I'm gonna fall into the gravity well of one of the two slavish mentalities. And I don't want to be a slave, and I'm willing to pay any price, even a life of lifelong, struggle, the agon of an Aristos, in order to avoid it. Phil, come off mute and tell us what's on your mind.
Yeah, on the one hand, I believe that some sort of understanding intellectually is important and psychologically is important. But that has to be tested on the ground. This is what I believe. I'll give you a personal example. When I went to college, I really fell in love with music. I was in the music library all the time listening to, the great composers and so forth. And I was from a very poor family. And so it was very difficult to save any money. I eventually wanted to get a good enough record player that I could listen to these music at my pleasure at home or whatever. I loved it very much. And I remember this argument came up when I made a complaint about my nephews, because I don't have any children, but I'm reasonably close to my nephews. And I felt, of course, they were young, but they weren't real young, but they were young. And you understand that children have not quite perfected themselves yet. But I said, I'm a little concerned about the progress. They seem to be quite self-oriented sometimes and don't pay enough attention to others. And they don't seem to have, well, not all of them, but 2 out of 3 of them didn't seem to have the drive to actually to sacrifice for anything that's deep. And my sister, of course, being very protective with children, says, what have you done that distinguishes you? And she lived through it and she understood. I said, I seem to remember when I was in college, it took me 2 years to save enough money to buy a record player that satisfied me. And that was very difficult because I was very poor and I went many, many days, well, usually not consecutively too often, not eating. That's where it came from. And she saw that happening. She knew it happened. She knew how poor I was. And finally I got it. And that's what I knew, that I had the ability, not only driven by my desire, that you have to weigh the balance between your desire for something that's very deep, that you want, and you have to balance that with the degree that you might have to sacrifice, and suffer the consequences of a kind of pathos to go through it. If you're not willing to pay that price, then there's always going to come down to, nah, I'm not that interested after all. I mean, despite the fact that all their logic might tell you that you do want to do that thing. I also remember that I love music so much that I did, instead of majoring art, and I actually invented a major. At that time, they didn't have such a major, which I call a fine art field major. I had to get special permission from the dean, construct that major, in which I took music and theater and some literature, history, and of course art and some music. And I remember going there, and that approached the second layer, in which I was just so terrible at it. And I thought, well, maybe if I began very much younger, I didn't have the deep appreciation for music already, things wouldn't sound so bad and I could grow with it, right? But insofar as like I was already quite developed in my hearing ability of understanding music, appreciating it in the sense of at least appreciating sound, everything sounded dissonant and out of coordination and a lack of skills. I couldn't do it. And I might have even gone into music despite of that, because my aptitude test actually said that I love music more than the visual arts. But then I thought it's going to be hard enough to be a visual artist. But with my lack of skill in music, if I had no other skill, maybe I would have gone into it, despite that. But I said, yeah, I have a backup plan, I suppose. I wouldn't call that a backup plan because it's something I wanted to do very much because my major was in art, in a sense. I said, yeah, I'm going to stick with art. So in a sense, that's kind of like almost a second test. It's like, okay, yeah, you want to do this, but you also say, yeah, but are you appropriate for doing this, despite the fact that you're willing to make certain sacrifices going without, not within, but without. So I decided I'll stick with art, but I'll always be an avid, consumer or listener of music, and that's not a problem. So, and I think that I have a reasonably deep appreciation for music, despite the fact that I lack the musical training, because I abandoned that because it was just inappropriate for me. And when I listen to somebody who really knows music, like Leonard Bernstein, I really appreciate it. So I think that comes at the test, like, oh yeah, you think you love music, how much are you willing to sacrifice for that? You think you love music, what do you think your skills are that's appropriate for that, right? The first one fits, the second one didn't. Better go for the backup plan. And even at art, I remember I had a backup plan. I said, I'm willing, I love one of these things so much, art, of course, very high, and music very high. I'll just end up being a teacher. If I can't do that, I'll end up working in a machine shop if I have to, And I think that's appropriate to have a backup plan, when it gets really too hard even for you. I mean, I'm not going to pretend that I'm Sisyphus. Halfway up the hill, I'll probably say, no, this is not for me, right? That was, where's the plateau for you to sink back to? And I think that if you're a parent, you should not inhibit your children for pursuing what they want, but you want them to maneuver them to at least some kind of backup plan. Otherwise, like, yeah, you're going to roll down the hill with the boulder and probably be at the bottom of it. So that's an important thing. I think instead of pressuring them to become what you want them to be, you let them be, but you have to like sort of subtly suggest some options that they might think of, and then also be willing to back them up to a certain degree, and not infinite degree like a mother would, when they failed, to give them a chance to restart. That's it, and the way I did that for my nephew, because he was very confused with what he was. It just so happened I happened to fit part of his type. I finally cleared him up, and he's now a reasonable designer. He realized that he couldn't be an artist because I actually tried to teach him about art, and he said, "No, I'm a little bit more scientific than you are." So I'm going to go into design, which is perfectly fine with me. So he's much more coordinated with the social structure than I would be, but still have an aspect of the arts within him. That's it, Phil.
Thanks, Phil. So I wanted to wrap up today. I see that in the according to David in the stream chat, not here in Zoom but elsewhere where he's streaming it to, there was a question, and it was about, are we saying that no one can arrive at the truth? Is that what we're saying? Is that the claim? Because if so, it sounds like an absolute ultimate claim about knowledge. And of course, we have to first distinguish between what we think versus what the purpose of this chapter is, which is to help us understand what the ancient Greeks think. We're trying to learn how not to have a single point of view, but how to have multiple different point of views so that we can shift between them as we need to address problems that might fall in the blind spot of our favorite point of view, but might be more visible and comprehensible from an alternative point of view. So in this chapter 4, we're studying the ancient worldview, and we're studying it specifically with the goal of trying to learn to see closer to the way that they saw and not the way that we see. What are the things that are different in the way they saw the world? And a critical part of it is this core understanding that was central to the Greeks, that mortality is the fundamental truth of humanity, that we are limited, and we are limited according to the lyric poets. This great book I read, Aspects of Death in Early Greek Art and Poetry. I love it. It's so good. It was a couple of years ago. It was a big breakthrough when I found it. And she quotes all of these lyric poets who are saying things that sound like Heraclitus, but they're before Heraclitus. They're writing before Heraclitus wrote. And that's when I'm starting to understand Heraclitus not as a solo visionary philosopher, but as part of a richer culture where he's weaving together different threads and insights. So they saw the mortality of human beings as being about three things. Death, sure, but that's only one of the three. And actually the least objectionable of the three things. All of these things come from our finitude, right? So the duration of our life is finite. It comes to an end and then we're dead. And that's one of the fundamental characteristics of being immortal. And it bugs us all. It bugs everybody. It's part of why people invent religions that allow them to live forever, is they're trying to escape from the human condition. But the Greeks thought that was not the worst thing about being a finite mortal. The second thing, which is worse than that, is that you can't even leave behind you gifts to humanity that last forever, right? Whether you're building a building, someday it's going to fall down. If you write a work, someday it's going to be lost. No matter what you try to create, it too is mortal. All the works produced by a mortal are themselves also mortal. They inherit that mortality. They inherit the finitude from us. And so there are limits to the good that we can do, even beyond our life. That doesn't mean we don't try, right? Just like the fact that we're going to die doesn't mean we commit suicide. We have a time during which we can act and work and try to do good. And we can leave behind us works that last longer than we do. They're just not going to last forever, and we have to make our peace with that. There'll come a time when not only are we forgotten, but all the good that we tried to set in motion will also be forgotten, and that's just the way it is. But that still wasn't what they considered the worst part of being mortal, being finite. And this goes directly to the question that was asked in the live stream chat. The thing they hated the most is that we're so stupid. Even the smartest of us is an idiot. And the definition of this is, first of all, that we look at the world from our own perspective, because this is where our eyes are. This is where our ears are. I can't tell you what's happening on Mars, or really in any of this vast infinite cosmos. I can only tell you what's happening in this little room. And thank goodness for technology, because I can look into your rooms too, but that's still just, six. Well, David, of course, is not sharing his videos. 5 little points of entry into the world. And those are, that doesn't even come close to the infinitude that would be required to even be aware of what's happening in the cosmos, let alone to think intelligent thoughts about it. So we're mostly ignorant all the time. We have just this little spark of conscious thought that's highly error prone. And we have a limited time in which to accumulate memories, and we're imperfect in our ability to remember them. But above all, we have a tiny little slice of life, which is the part that we get to look around and figure out what's going on for a while. And the Greeks thought it is okay to make your peace with this. For them, it was hard. They hated. As the author of the book says, man, did they hate being stupid. These guys wanted more than anything to be smart. It really frustrated them that the human condition involved being so dumb. And it's worth struggling to be smarter tomorrow than you were today. It's worth trying to learn more and learn to master our character and our biases and so on, so that we can improve the quality, because we just have to acknowledge that the scale for genuine intelligence is an infinite scale that we can't approach, which means we're not even playing that game. If it comes to arriving at the truth, i.e. all of the truth, the ultimate truth, nothing but the truth, we can't do that. That's not for us. We're mortals. The game we're playing at is, can we be more honest and more accurate than we were yesterday, or than our neighbor might be? Can we strive to do better? And that's the game that we're in. And it's a worthwhile game. It makes a huge difference to us and our lives, whether we're captured by delusion, slaves to our ideologies and desires, or whether we are struggling with them enough to try to create some little bit of space in which we can live a life that's more conscious and sane and healthy than where we started out. So, no one arrives at the truth. This wasn't an extraordinary claim to the Greeks. This was like saying you can't accurately fit a map of the Earth, which is the surface of a sphere, onto a flat piece of paper. You just can't do it. It's a geometrical problem. They're incompatible. And so to say we can't fit the infinite knowledge of the cosmos into our finite consciousness, this was not an extraordinary claim to the ancients. Well, of course you can't. They're completely different aspects of reality. This is not about nihilism. It's not about claiming that nobody can know anything. It's about acknowledging that we're never going to have the whole truth. It's just not going to happen. And the parts that we're missing matter. And it's okay. That's the human condition, making our peace with it and doing the best we can. Stephen, come off mute. Tell us what's on your mind, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, it was just a point I was bringing up in another meeting. This thing with Nietzsche, and of course we've got Dostoevsky saying something similar, and that's about the shallowness of the modern intelligentsia. This is what they were warning about. It's to say the modern intelligentsia are like, they are intelligentsia, but they're intelligentsia at a childlike state. They're still in the children's creche, trying to make decisions about the adult's world. Something goes back to Goethe. It's a problem with generalization. It's a problem with the use of categories. And I think one of the great examples of shallowness of thought was the invasion of Iraq in 2003. Bush Jr. was operating on the idea we only have to get our foot in the door. I don't know, maybe he was planning to sell them a vacuum cleaner. But he had the mentality, this is a spoiled guy, a privileged guy. I only have to get my foot in the door, and in Hegelian fashion, everything will fall into place. Instead, everything fell apart. But this mentality, you only have to get your foot in the door. And those primitives over there will see the blessed light of Western civilization shining into their eyes, and they'll fall at your feet, kissing them. This was a mentality of 2003. It's sort of stuff that worries me. Thank you.
Worries me too, Stephen. Thank you for bringing it up. And with that, we'll wrap up for this week, and we'll pick this up again next week. It's this is rich stuff here that he's getting into in this paragraph. So it's fine. It takes multiple weeks to get through. This is the direct relate, and ultimately this is what Hegel would build his entire philosophical framework off of, the idea that there ought to be a relationship between our faculties of the mind, the human character types that result, our behavior, and the resulting cultures and societies that we create from them, as well as the course of history and historical epochs. All of these things develop out of each other and are directly related to each other. This was his goal, to create this organic set of relationships between what people had previously treated as completely unrelated disciplines. That he saw a continuity and a logic and development between them. So it makes sense that this is some tricky, rich stuff that we're going through. So thanks, everybody, and I'll see you all next Monday. Take care.